They were not born behind walls. They had homes, voices, laughter, and futures. And then, almost overnight, the world narrowed into a few crowded streets surrounded by bricks and barbed wire. Imagine waking up one morning and learning that your city is now a prison, and everyone you love is trapped inside with you. No trial, no crime, just your existence. The walls didn't go up all at once. They rose slowly, like a hand closing around a throat. First, a street you couldn't walk on, then a shop you couldn't enter, then a job you could no longer keep, and finally, the gates, locked, guarded, final. Inside, there was hunger, more hunger than words can hold. But there was also something the architects of this cage never understood. People held on to songs, stories, and the stubborn, impossible belief that life still meant something. That love still mattered. That tomorrow could be different. But as days passed, the walls did not shift. They tightened, and what began as confinement would soon become something far darker, a waiting room for death. This is the story of the ghettos. Not just the suffering, but the resistance of the human spirit when the world tried to erase it. And once you step inside, you will not forget what you see. Chapter 1. The Roots of Isolation. It did not begin with barbed wire. It did not begin with trains or gas chambers or camps hidden deep in forests. It began long before that, quietly, almost invisibly, woven into the laws, the streets, the whispers of marketplaces, the sermons of churches, and the habits of entire civilizations. Before the world would trap millions behind walls, it first learned how to treat them as outsiders. The story of the ghettos does not begin in the 20th century. It begins centuries earlier, in crowded alleyways, in locked gates, in neighborhoods deliberately carved out to separate one group of people from the rest. The world had been practicing the art of confinement long before the Nazis arrived to perfect it. In medieval Europe, life was arranged around fear as much as faith. Communities clung to what was familiar, and anything outside that was painted as suspicious, dangerous, or sinful. Jews had lived across Europe for centuries, but they were never allowed to fully belong. They were tolerated only so long as they remained useful, and even then, always apart. You can imagine the sound of church bells ringing through narrow stone streets, merchants calling out their prices, the smell of hay and with smoke in the air, and in the middle of it all, a neighborhood that everyone knew was different. Not by accident, by design. The year was 1516, and the city was Venice, a place of trade, of wealth, of glittering canals and massed festivals. But even in a city that flourished through contact with the wider world, there was an anxiety about those who did not fit neatly into its identity. The Venetian Senate issued a decree. The Jewish population was to be confined to a small, walled island in the northern part of the city. It was a place where metal was melted and worked, known as the Ghetto Nuovo, the foundry. The name would become the word ghetto. What began as a location on a map soon became a model for separation that would echo across continents and centuries. At night, the gates of the Venetian ghetto were locked. Guards patrolled the bridges. Jews could not leave until morning. The sound of iron bolts scraping shut signaled the end of the day and the beginning of the silence. The kind of silence that tells you not that the world is resting, but that the world has turned its back. Children in the ghetto grew up hearing the click of locks as a daily rhythm, as normal as the tide moving beneath the city's stones. It was here that Europe learned how to create a prison without calling it one. Yet this segregation did not simply appear out of cruelty alone. It was dressed in moral language. It was justified through religion. It was defended through law. Across Christian Europe, Jews were accused of being responsible for the death of Christ, an accusation that would ignite violence again and again, from whispered threats to full massacres. In times of plague, they were blamed for poisoning wells. In times of famine, they were accused of hoarding grain. Whenever society suffered, the blame did not rise organically. It was directed, shaped, guided like a weapon. By the 13th century, the Catholic Church began issuing formal restrictions. Jews could not own land. They could not hold certain professions. They were often forced to wear identifying clothing, a hat, a badge, a color. Imagine walking through a crowded city square where every glance, every whisper, every shift in posture is a reminder that you are marked before you even speak. Not for what you have done, but for who you are. As their options narrowed, many Jewish communities were pushed into one trade that Christian law discouraged among its own believers: lending money with interest. This made Jewish people essential because every kingdom, every merchant guild, every noble family depended on credit, but also made them easy to hate. They were needed, yet despised for fulfilling the role society designed for them. It was a trap made of social necessity and manufactured resentment. Over time, segregation became an architectural truth. Cities across Europe began building Jewish quarters, sometimes small, sometimes sprawling, always enclosed. Gates, curfews, taxes that were harsher for Jews than for anyone else. The pattern was repeated from Prague to Frankfurt, from Rome to Krakow. Different cities, different rulers, different languages, but the same message: you are here but not of here. You can live among us, but never with us. The atmosphere in these early ghettos was not only shaped by restrictions, but by a constant tension between survival and identity. You can imagine families lighting candles on Friday evenings, the faint scent of bread and herbs filling cramped kitchen rooms. The murmured prayers, the sacred melodies sung softly so they would not draw attention. Life persisted, but always behind walls, always watched. Children grew up knowing how to move quietly, how to avoid provoking a guard's attention, how to measure joy carefully, as if too much of it might be taken away. There were times when Jews rose in influence, became advisors to kings, scholars, respected physicians. But every time their presence was tolerated, it was conditional, dependent on the mood of the ruler or the needs of the economy. A change in leadership, a bad harvest, a rumor whispered in a tavern, a priest who wanted more power, and everything could be lost overnight. Whole communities were expelled from England in 1390, from Spain in 1492, from Portugal in 1497. Thousands of families loading what little they owned into carts, walking roads that felt endless. The smell of dust, the taste of fear, the knowledge that the land beneath your feet might never be home again. The fear of the other became deeply rooted in the European imagination. It was passed down like an heirloom, from father to son, teacher to student, priest to congregation. By the time the 19th century dawned, and Europe transitioned into the age of science and reason, anti-Semitism did not disappear. It changed form. It modernized. It put on a lab coat. Pseudo-scientific theories emerged, claiming that human worth could be measured by skull shape, or blood purity, or racial categorization. These ideas were absurd, but they were appealing to governments and elites who wanted simple explanations and convenient enemies. The old religious hatred now had a new vocabulary, one dressed in scientific authority. Jews were no longer described merely as spiritually different. Now they were called racially different, unchangeable, permanent, dangerous. This shift was critical, because if hatred is based on religion, then conversion is possible. But if hatred is based on race, then there is no escape. A person is condemned simply by being born. By the late 19th century, these racial theories were spreading through books, universities, and public debates. Newspapers published caricatures portraying Jews with exaggerated features: greedy, diseased, manipulative. Popular plays mocked them. Political parties campaigned on promises to protect the nation from them. The language of exclusion was no longer whispered. It was shouted from platforms, printed in pamphlets, normalized in casual conversation. Then came the 20th century, and with it, crisis. Europe was scarred by war, inflation, and a collapse of old empires. When people are afraid, they look for someone to blame. And when societies look for scapegoats, they rarely need to search far. The familiar target was already prepared. Centuries of myth, rumor, law, and architecture had ensured that. By the time Adolf Hitler entered the political scene in the 1920s, the groundwork had already been laid. He did not invent anti-Semitism. He inherited it. He refined it. He weaponized it. He took old superstitions, old resentments, old prejudices, and wrapped them in the language of national destiny and racial purity. He did not need to convince the world to hate the Jews. He only needed to give that hatred structure, purpose, and power. The ghettos of the 20th century, the ones that would later become symbols of suffering on an unimaginable scale, were not a sudden invention. They were a return to something Europe already knew how to build. The walls had existed before. The difference was that this time, the walls were not meant to control. They were meant to destroy. The world had spent centuries training itself to look away. And soon it would. But what began as confinement would soon transform into something far more deliberate. The ghettos of the Nazi era were not merely places of separation. They were steps in a process planned carefully, bureaucratically, systematically. And in the next stage of that process, the walls would not just hold people in. They would remove them from the world. Chapter 2, Nazi racial ideology takes hold. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when hatred transforms from an emotion into a system. Hatred by itself is not enough to create a machine capable of reshaping nations and extinguishing millions of lives. Hatred is raw, chaotic, unpredictable. For it to become powerful, it must be organized. It must be structured. It must be taught, written, repeated, and enforced. And in Germany, during the early 20th century, hatred found that structure. It found law. It found leadership. It found the tools to become policy. The walls that would later rise around ghettos began here, in lecture halls, in speeches, in rallies where the crowd roared so loud that individual thought dissolved into collective obedience. Germany, after the First World War, was a nation raw with humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles did not merely demand reparations and territorial losses. It demanded that Germany accept guilt. The soul of a nation wounded by war now felt publicly shamed. The economy collapsed. Inflation reached levels unimaginable. Savings that families had built for decades became worthless overnight. People carried money in baskets just to buy bread. Hunger hollowed the faces of children. Lines outside soup kitchens stretched for blocks. Factories closed. Soldiers who had survived the trenches returned home, not to parades, but to unemployment and despair. A country that once saw itself as strong, cultured, and modern was now broken, angry, and searching for someone to blame. It is in moments like these that dangerous ideas find fertile ground. People want answers, and simple answers are always more seductive than complex ones. And there was already a lie waiting in the shadows, rehearsed across centuries, sharpened across generations. The belief that Jews were responsible for Germany's suffering, not just as individuals, as a people, as a force, as an enemy hidden in plain sight. The rise of Adolf Hitler did not begin as an inevitability. He was not born powerful. He constructed his power through words. He learned how to speak to a crowd, how to amplify their insecurities, how to reflect their rage back to them and call it truth. His speeches were not calm, reasoned, or intellectual. They were storms. He shouted. He pointed. He paced. He cast himself as a prophet returning a stolen destiny. And in the smoke-filled beer halls of Munich, surrounded by veterans who felt betrayed and workers who felt abandoned, his message found an audience. He spoke of a Germany that had been stabbed in the back. He spoke of traitors within. He named those traitors. And as he spoke, the myths of centuries, the medieval accusations, the economic grievances, the conspiracy theories, merged into a single narrative, that Jews were not simply different. They were the enemy inside the nation, the enemy disguised as neighbor, doctor, professor, merchant. This idea did not appear suddenly. It arrived like a river already flowing, gathering force, deepening its current. But Hitler did something new. He took anti-Semitism and turned it into a racial theory. He argued that Jews were not a religious group, not a culture, not a community, but a race. A biological threat. Something inheritable, inescapable, present in blood. This was a crucial shift. Because if identity is biological, then no amount of participation, loyalty, or achievement can change one's place in society. A Jewish war hero was still a Jew. A Jewish scientist, a Jewish poet, a Jewish mother holding her child. They were all marked the same. It erased individuality and replaced it with a label. By the late 1920s, Hitler's message moved from taverns to national elections. The Nazi Party grew. Their rallies expanded. The swastika, bright red and black, became a banner of rebirth to some and a warning to others. But it was not the symbol alone that captured people. It was the promise. The promise of restored pride. The promise of economic revival. The promise of unity and belonging. And belonging is one of humanity's most powerful needs. The Nazis understood that to consolidate power, they could not merely preach ideology. They had to embed it in daily life. Propaganda became the air Germany breathed. Posters showed Jews as rats or parasites infecting the German body. Films depicted them as predators. Children in schools were taught racial science, charts, diagrams, measurements of the skull, all presented as objective truth. Teachers repeated these lessons with authority. Students recited them with confidence. A new generation grew up believing that hatred was not hatred. It was knowledge. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. And suddenly, the ideas that once belonged to speeches became law. One of the first actions of the new government was to purge the civil service of Jews. Judges, lawyers, professors, doctors, people whose identities were tied to their profession, were forced out. Jobs that had taken decades to earn disappeared with the signing of a decree. Names were removed from office doors. Classrooms emptied. Hospitals lost surgeons who had saved countless lives. But this was only the beginning. The Nazi regime needed to define clearly who was a Jew and who was not. And so, in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were introduced. These laws did not mention gas chambers. They did not mention ghettos. They did not mention violence. Their language was clinical, bureaucratic, cold. But their impact was devastating. Jews were forbidden from marrying or even having relationships with non-Jews. They were stripped of citizenship. Their passports were marked. Their identity was no longer their own to claim. Imagine standing in line at a government office, holding papers that declare you no longer belong to the country where your family has lived for generations. The humiliation did not need to be shouted. It was written in ink. The Nazis continued to tighten restrictions, each one just small enough to avoid widespread outrage, but significant enough to erode daily life. Jews could no longer own businesses. They could no longer attend public schools. They could no longer sit on park benches. They were barred from libraries, theaters, and concert halls. Places that hold memory, joy, imagination, closed. And then came Kristallnacht. On the night of November 9th, 1938, the sound of breaking glass echoed across German cities. Windows of Jewish shops shattered. Synagogues burned. Sacred books were thrown into the streets. Homes were invaded. People were beaten, arrested, killed. Firefighters were instructed not to intervene unless the flames threatened non-Jewish property. The smell of burning would mix with the bitter scent of fear. The streets glowed with embers. By morning, the world could not pretend not to see. And yet, the world did not stop what was coming. Kristallnacht was not a riot. It was a message, a test, a declaration that violence was now sanctioned, not hidden. Jews understood then that staying would not mean surviving. But many still could not leave. Borders were closing. Countries refused visas. Ships carrying Jewish refugees were turned away. Families watched opportunities for escape vanish like smoke. Meanwhile, Nazi racial theory continued to grow more elaborate. The Nazis categorized people according to a hierarchy. At the top, the Aryan, ideal, blonde hair, blue eyes, strong, pure. In reality, the image was a fantasy. But fantasy is powerful when repeated with confidence. At the bottom of the hierarchy were those considered unworthy of life: Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, homosexuals, political dissidents. The world was divided into those who were permitted to exist and those who were not. The Nazis expanded their reach into every aspect of German society. Newspapers printed racial stories daily. Radio broadcasts repeated slogans. Parades filled the streets with drums and flags. The rhythm of the regime was constant, unwavering, inescapable. And slowly, many Germans adapted. Some believed, some feared, some felt relieved to be inside the group rather than outside it. And a few resisted, quietly, dangerously, but their voices were drowned in the roar of the majority. When the Second World War began in 1939, everything intensified. Conquest gave the Nazis millions of additional Jewish lives to control. And now, with territory expanding and borders shifting, the question became, what to do with them? The answer did not appear immediately. It developed step by step, each step darker than the last. First came marking and registration, then forced labor, then relocation, and finally, the ghettos. The idea of separating Jews physically from the rest of society was not new. Europe had done it before, but under Nazi rule, the purpose was different. The ghettos were no longer neighborhoods of confinement. They were instruments, tools in a larger design. They were not built to manage a population. They were built to weaken, starve, break, and prepare millions for removal. The ideology that had once been discussed in speeches now became architecture. Streets were blocked. Walls were erected. Families were uprooted. Children cried as soldiers knocked on doors and gave orders that could not be refused. Policemen who once protected their neighbors now escorted them to the edges of the city, to the gates of their new prison. And across Europe, from Warsaw to Lodz to Krakow to Vilnius, city maps began to change. Districts were redrawn. Lines were drawn not by geography, but by identity. Identity became destiny. Destiny became death. But the ghettos were only the second stage. The final stage had not yet begun. And when it did, even the walls would not be enough to contain what was coming next. Chapter 3: The First Forced Relocations. There is a moment, just before history changes, when ordinary life still pretends to continue. People still buy bread. They still sweep doorsteps. Children still chase each other down narrow streets. The world wants to believe that stability can be willed into existence, that the familiar can survive the storm gathering overhead. But history does not wait for consent. It advances quietly at first, then all at once. And in the autumn of 1939, after Germany invaded Poland, the shift began, not with mass killings, not with camps, but with orders. Orders that would uproot millions from their homes and begin the physical process of separating Jewish lives from the rest of the world. When German troops marched into Poland, the invasion was fast, brutal, and methodical. Tanks crushed roads. Artillery turned city blocks into rubble. The sound of boots hitting cobblestone streets was accompanied by the low, growing dread of civilians watching soldiers who did not speak their language, did not smile, did not acknowledge their humanity. Poles suffered under occupation from the first hour, but for Jewish communities, the danger was immediate and unmistakable. The Nazis did not need time to decide what to do with them. The ideology was already in place. Now it simply needed to be enacted. The first step was movement, forced movement. Jews were ordered to leave their homes and relocate to designated areas, supposedly for administrative organization. The language was bureaucratic, even polite at times. Official papers described the transfers as temporary, necessary, systematic. But the reality was chaos. German soldiers went door to door, sometimes with lists, sometimes without, commanding families to pack what they could carry. Not everything, not even most things, only what you could hold without slowing the column of people being driven down the street. Pots, blankets, photos, these were luxuries. The most common question was simple and unanswerable. What should we take? And beneath it, a deeper fear. How long will we be gone? Neighbors watched from windows as Jewish families, some wealthy, some poor, some old, some young, walked past in silence. Some watched with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with indifference, and some with relief, because fear had already taught them which side of the line they wanted to be on. The first relocations did not yet involve walls. Not at the beginning. They involved herding, moving populations into districts considered undesirable or less valuable. Older parts of cities, industrial areas, streets where buildings leaned at odd angles and gutters overflowed when it rained. Places where the ground felt tired. These districts were not yet sealed, but their boundaries were understood. Jewish families arriving found themselves packed into overcrowded apartments, often shared with multiple other households. Privacy was the first casualty of displacement. Dignity followed closely behind. The German administrators called this concentration, not in the sense of camps, not yet, but in the sense of focusing a population into a smaller, contained space. The goal was control. To watch, to monitor, to categorize. Every person was recorded, photographed, given identification. Paperwork multiplied. The Jewish presence became something measured, documented, defined by numbers rather than names. But control alone was not enough. The Nazis wanted separation, not just physical separation, but psychological and social separation. And so, restrictions followed relocation. Jews were banned from parks, then from shops, then from sidewalks. Signs appeared, no Jews allowed. Trains, cinemas, pharmacies, schools. Life fractioned into permitted and forbidden spaces. The world shrank again, not with walls, but with rules. Over time, the relocations grew larger, more systematic, more urgent. Small towns were emptied of their Jewish residents entirely. Villages in Poland and western Ukraine saw their Jewish populations marched to regional centers, cities where German administrators could oversee them more efficiently. The journey was not always long, but it felt endless. Roads dusted with footprints, horses pulling carts overloaded with mattresses, pots, and children who could not walk any farther. The crack of rifle butts striking the ground to signal movement. The quiet sobbing of someone who had realized they left behind a family heirloom that would now never be recovered. The sense of dislocation was overwhelming. People no longer recognized themselves. Their identity, once tied to a neighborhood, a synagogue, a market stall, a schoolyard, was now dissolved into the mass movement of bodies. They were no longer families. They were columns. They were no longer people. They were groups to be counted. Among the first major cities to be transformed in this way was Lodz. Before the war, Lodz was a textile hub, filled with the hum of factories and the voices of workers speaking Polish, Yiddish, and German. By early 1940, that soundscape changed. Jews from surrounding villages were forced into the northern district of the city, an area of aging tenement buildings and narrow streets. It was not yet a ghetto, not officially, but it had already become one in practice. The Germans cut tram lines. They rerouted traffic. They controlled who could enter and who could leave. Isolation was taking shape like a sculpture carved slowly from stone, each restriction removing another piece of connection to the outside world. The relocation orders did not only come from German voices. Sometimes they were delivered by local police, forced into compliance. Sometimes by Jewish community leaders, pressured into passing along instructions they did not choose, did not believe in, and could not refuse. This was one of the cruelest strategies of the Nazi process, compelling victims to participate in the structure of their own confinement. It created anguish. It sowed resentment. It fractured the unity that might have otherwise formed. New arrivals tried to find places to sleep. Rooms designed for a single family now held 3 or 4. Children slept on floors. Elderly grandparents leaned against walls because there was no bed left to lie on. The smell of too many bodies in too little space filled the air, sweat, fatigue, sickness, hope trying to survive in suffocating quarters. Even before the walls were built, the ghetto existed in the mind. It existed in the feeling of being trapped, not by fences, but by the knowledge that there was nowhere else to go. What made these early relocations devastating was not only the loss of physical space, but the severing of identity. Synagogues that had stood for generations were left behind. Cemeteries where ancestors rested were now inaccessible. Schools where students once recited prayers were locked. The center of life shifted not by choice, but by force. People were being uprooted from their history, as though a tree could be ripped from the ground and expected to live simply because it was replanted. And yet, in the midst of this displacement, there were attempts to maintain dignity. Families hung photographs on peeling walls. They whispered bedtime stories so children might sleep without fear. They baked bread when they could find flour. They lit candles for holidays, even if they had to shield the flame from the wind leaking through broken window panes. The human instinct to preserve meaning is stronger than almost any force that seeks to erase it. But meaning cannot stop what was coming next. In Warsaw, the largest Jewish population in Europe became the most visible symbol of forced concentration. The city was vast, and within it, Jewish life had once flourished with synagogues, schools, libraries, theaters, bookstores. The relocation shattered that world. Jewish families from neighborhoods across the city and from surrounding regions were pushed into an area already densely populated. Streets that once carried the smells of fresh bread, coffee, and roasted chestnuts now smelled of sewage, overcrowding, and hunger. Still, the walls were not yet built. Not quite, not fully, but everyone knew a line had been drawn. The air felt heavier. German soldiers stood at corners where none had stood before. People walked faster. Conversations were shorter. The world was holding its breath. Then came the ceiling. It began with notices. Printed, posted, distributed. They were written in official language, as though announcing new tram schedules rather than the enclosure of hundreds of thousands of lives. But behind that bureaucratic tone were marching orders for a prison disguised as a city district. Construction crews arrived. Brick by brick, boards by board, barbed wire by barbed wire. Walls rose around the concentrated districts. Gates were installed, guard positioned, and the world inside shrank again. This time, not just in spirit, but in stone and iron. But to understand the ghettos, one must understand that this moment, the ceiling, was not the beginning of tragedy. It was the continuation of a process already well underway. The physical walls were simply the visible expression of walls that had long existed in law, in propaganda, in the minds of those who believed separation to be not only acceptable, but necessary. For those inside, the emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. Some cried, some fell silent, some stood at the windows and watched as the last gap closed. The outside world did not disappear. It remained visible, just beyond the wall, but it had become unreachable. The hardest part was not losing the world. It was seeing it, hearing it, smelling it, and knowing you could no longer step into it. From this point forward, relocation was not temporary. It was confinement. Life had been narrowed to survival. And yet, even within the walls, people still hoped. Because they did not yet know what lay beyond the next stage. They still believed relocation was the worst that would come. They could not imagine what the ghettos were preparing them for. But the architects of this system could. Because the ghettos were not the end. They were only the waiting room. And soon, the trains would arrive. Chapter 4. Sealing the Ghettos. The walls did not rise in one day. They appeared gradually, like a silent verdict being carried out in slow motion. At first, they were just piles of bricks stacked at street corners, bundles of wooden boards near alleyways, coils of barbed wire delivered without explanation. People hoped, or perhaps forced themselves to believe, that these materials were for military defenses, or road repairs, or any other ordinary purpose. But deep down, there's already a terrible understanding forming. Walls are never built for those outside. Walls are built to contain. In city after city, the German occupation forces began marking boundaries, not with ink on a map, but with guards standing in intersections, pointing civilians into new directions, forbidding access to familiar streets. The sound of boots on cobblestones became the soundtrack of transformation. You could hear it from windows, from bakery doorways, from stairwells where people leaned out just to see what had changed. And what had changed was everything. The process that had begun as displacement was now entering its next phase, enclosure. In Warsaw, the largest ghetto in Europe, the ceiling was monumental. Before the war, Warsaw had been alive with sound. A city of streetcars rattling along tracks, of musicians playing on corners, of merchants calling out prices, of children running between bakery stalls. But now, as German authorities posted the decree announcing the closure of the Jewish district, the city fell into a different silence. People read the words, some fainting, some going numb, some folding the paper as though keeping it intact could somehow postpone the meaning it carried. The decree stated that Jews were forbidden to reside outside the designated district. Any non-Jews living inside were ordered to relocate. Families who had lived side by side for generations were forced apart. Doors that once opened between neighbors now became borders. And, as the deadline arrived, movement flooded the streets. Carts rolled. Children cried. Men staggered under the weight of furniture tied together with rope. The air smelled of sweat and dust, and the bitterness of a future being sealed along with the district. The walls rose, brick by brick. They were not graceful. They were crude, fast, uneven in places, patchwork in others. But they were tall, sometimes reaching twice the height of a man. And atop the walls, barbed wire twisted like metal thorns. The wire glinted in the sun during the day and looked like dark, jagged teeth in the fading light of evening. Guards were stationed at gates, rifles slung casually at their sides, expressions blank. They did not need a shout. The wall spoke loudly enough. Inside the newly sealed ghetto, life changed immediately. Streets once open now felt claustrophobic. The same buildings stood in the same places, but everything felt smaller. The sky felt farther away. Air felt heavier, and time felt slower. People walked differently, head down, shoulders tense, movements careful. Even the simplest act, like stepping outside to fetch water or bread, was now filled with anxiety, as though every gesture might draw attention. Because inside the ghetto, attention was dangerous. The official explanation for sealing the ghettos was public health. German authorities claimed that Jews carried disease, particularly typhus, and that the walls were necessary to protect the rest of the population. It was a lie, of course, a lie that turned hatred into policy while masquerading as responsibility. But lies backed by guns do not need to be believed in order to be obeyed. And the world outside the walls, whether out of fear or indifference or convenience, accepted the story. Inside the walls, disease did spread, but not because of the people, because of the conditions engineered around them. The ghettos were overcrowded. Rooms meant for one family held 3 or 4. Streets became rivers of bodies. Windows were cracked and could not be repaired. Clean water was rationed. Human waste overflowed from pipes not built to accommodate such numbers. Food was scarce. The German authorities controlled the rations and provided just enough to keep people alive, but weakened. Hunger became part of the air, part of the stomach, part of the bones. The ration for a Jewish person was sometimes less than 1/3 of the calories allotted to a German civilian. Bread that was mostly sawdust. Potatoes that were mostly rot. Soup so thin it could have been water left in a pot where vegetables once boiled. People learned to stretch food, to trade scraps, to pretend fullness for the sake of their children. Mothers chewed and then fed their children the softened pulp, hiding their own hunger behind forced smiles. Fathers skipped meals without saying why. Hunger turned faces sharp, eyes deep, movements slow. But hunger did not only affect the body. It affected the spirit. It made people irritable, silent, withdrawn. It made decisions impossible. What do you do when there is not enough for everyone? Who eats first? Who eats last? Who pretends they are not hungry, so someone else may survive another day? Even so, smuggling became a lifeline. Children, small enough to fit through cracks under the wall or holes in fences behind factories, became couriers of survival. They crawled through drainage pipes, ran across rooftops, slipped through shadows. Their feet were fast. Their hands were thin. Their faces were dirty, but their eyes were bright, sharp, determined. Some of them returned with bread. Some never returned at all. The adults waited, paced, stared at gates, counted seconds like heartbeats. A loaf of bread could mean life for a family for 3 days. The risk was worth everything. Smuggling did not stop the starvation, but it slowed it enough to allow people to keep breathing, to keep walking, to keep hoping. And hope was dangerous. Hope was necessary. Hope was sometimes the only thing that kept people alive. The walls changed the rhythm of days. There was no longer a city to move through, only a cage to circle. People walked the same streets over and over, wearing down the cobblestones in patterns that resembled desperation. Market stalls formed inside the ghetto, though there was little to sell. Someone might have onions. Someone might have fabric. Someone might have wood. Bartering replaced currency. Goods replaced money. The economy fractured because survival had no price. It had only value. And yet, in spite of starvation, disease, and confinement, the human instinct to create meaning persisted. Children still played, though their games were smaller. Instead of running freely, they hopped in place, or drew chalk circles around their feet, or rolled marbles across cracked stone. They laughed sometimes, and the laughter was startling, a sudden reminder that childhood tries to survive even in the harshest places. Prayer continued, in secret rooms, behind boarded windows, in whispers, a candle lit not for celebration, but for defiance, a melody sung not for joy, but for remembrance. But the sealing of the ghettos did more than confine bodies. It reshaped identity. It told people that there was no longer a line between inside and outside. The world had become divided between those allowed to live freely and those allowed to live only until someone decided otherwise. And that decision was coming. The ghettos were not designed to be permanent. They were designed to be transitional. They were way stations, preparations. The German authorities continued to describe the ghettos as temporary administrative zones. They spoke of resettlement, of relocation, of labor assignment. But those words were masks. Behind them was the reality that the ghettos were being starved deliberately, not as punishment, not as consequence, but as strategy. A weakened population is easier to control, easier to transport, easier to erase. Inside the walls, people whispered about rumors coming from outside. Villages disappearing, people being taken east. No one came back. Some said resettlement meant new farms or labor colonies. Others said something far worse. But details were scarce. Fear, however, was plentiful. And then there were the roundups. Random, sudden, violent. German soldiers stormed into courtyards, pulling men from workshops, dragging people from doorways, shouting orders that could not be refused. Sometimes they took 20 people, sometimes 200, sometimes none returned. These actions were meant to destabilize, to assure that no one could feel safe, that every knock on a door could mean the end. As walls sealed the ghettos, time itself seemed to warp. Days felt endless. Months passed without change. And yet, beneath the stillness, a clock was ticking. Something was being prepared. Something beyond the walls. The ghettos were becoming overcrowded, diseased, unsustainable by design. The pressure was rising. The system was being tested to see how much suffering could be imposed before collapse. But collapse was not the goal. The goal was to move to the next stage. And the next stage required something new. Trains. Trains that did not announce their destinations. Trains that did not return. Trains that would redefine the meaning of separation. The walls were complete. The population was weakened. The administration was efficient. The ghettos had served their purpose. Now, the machinery of death was ready to begin. Chapter 5. Life inside. Crowded, hungry, afraid. The walls stood now, solid and final. There was no more pretending that this was temporary, no more holding on to the illusion that relocation was just a phase of war. The gates closed each evening. Soldiers checked their rifles under streetlights, and the sound of the locks sliding into place echoed across courtyards and stairwells with the weight of a verdict. Life was now contained, compressed into narrow streets, cracked sidewalks, and rooms packed beyond imagination. This was not simply confinement. It was suffocation. The ghettos were not built to hold life. They were built to break it slowly, quietly, invisibly. Crowding was the first enemy. Entire families were forced to share a single room, sometimes with other families they had never met. Apartments designed for 4 people now held 12, 15, sometimes more. Mattresses were placed on floors, on tables, against walls. People slept sitting up, leaning against each other for warmth, for space, for what little comfort could be salvaged. Privacy vanished. Every movement was seen, every whisper overheard. Even grief became public. When someone cried, the sound filled the room. When someone died, the body had to remain in the room until it could be removed. Children learned early not to ask for space. There was none. The air inside these rooms felt heavy. It smelled of sweat, of damp clothing, of unwashed blankets, of sickness that never quite left. Windows were often broken and could not be repaired, so cold air slipped into rooms in winter and flies swarmed in summer. The seasons did not bring relief, only different kinds of discomfort. In winter, frost formed inside the glass, and people huddled together for warmth under coats and thin blankets. In summer, heat trapped between walls turned rooms into ovens, and children fainted from dehydration long before water could be fetched. Disease followed quickly. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and influenza spread like fire in dry grass. It took only one cough in a crowded room for sickness to pass from person to person, from child to parent to neighbor. There were no proper medicines. German authorities restricted medical supplies, claiming that resources were needed for soldiers. Hospitals inside the ghettos were overwhelmed, understaffed, and under-equipped. Doctors who had once worked in modern clinics now treated patients with torn cloth instead of bandages and boiled water instead of antiseptic. The smell of illness clung to the air, sour, metallic, unrelenting. But hunger was the constant force that defined every waking moment. The body can grow used to cold. It can learn to live alongside disease. But hunger gnaws from the inside. It steals strength, patience, memory, identity. It changes the shape of the face, cheeks hollow, eyes deep, lips dry. It changes the way people walk, slow, shuffling, every movement calculated to conserve the smallest fraction of energy. It changes the way people think. Food becomes the center of every thought, every conversation, every dream. Official rations were designed to starve. A Jewish person inside the ghetto was allotted less than 1/3 of what a German citizen outside received. Bread was more filler than grain, made from potato peelings, sawdust, and whatever scraps could be collected. Soup was watery liquid, sometimes with a few floating grains or shreds of cabbage. Meat was a rumor. Milk was for infants, if it could be found at all. People cooked over small stoves made from tin cans and bricks, burning furniture or broken crates when coal ran out. The smell of smoke always hung in the air, a reminder that survival required burning the same world you were trying to save. Families rationed food piece by piece. A loaf of bread was sliced slowly, carefully, as though the act of cutting itself might make it last longer. Parents skipped meals and pretended they had already eaten. Children learned to hide their hunger to avoid breaking their parents' hearts. The elderly often refused food entirely, placing their hands gently over the bowl and pushing it toward the youngest child. They did not say why. They did not need to. But hunger did not erase love. If anything, it sharpened it. People supported each other in ways that defied the purpose of the ghetto. Neighbors shared scraps when they could. A woman who had a potato gave half to the family next door. A man who found work in a labor shop smuggled home tiny pieces of bread in his coat lining. Children, small, thin, quick, became the secret lifeline of entire communities. They slipped through holes under the wall, crawled through drains, squeezed between piles of rubble, and darted into the outside city to trade or steal or beg for food. Their footsteps were light. Their eyes were bright. Their courage was greater than their bodies, and sometimes they did not come back. When a child slipped through the wall and returned, covered in dirt, clutching bread or potatoes or onions, the family embraced them with a joy so fierce it hurt. But that joy always carried fear, because the next time the child climbed through the same hole, there might be a guard waiting. The ghettos were not silent. They were loud, full of sound, movement, emotion, but every sound carried meaning. The scrape of a shoe on concrete could be a neighbor passing by, or it could be a patrol. The knock on a door could mean a friend, or it could mean a roundup. People listen the way animals in the wild listen, alert, tense, aware of every shift in the environment. And yet, even here, life continued. Weddings were held in secret. Two people joining their lives under a blanket hung as a canopy, whispers replacing celebration, love surviving in defiance of despair. Funerals were held quietly, prayers spoken softly so as not to draw attention, mourning compressed because grief took energy no one could spare. Births still happened, small, fragile babies wrapped in old fabric, surviving on the thinnest thread of hope. Schools continued, though unofficial, improvised. Teachers taught mathematics on scraps of cardboard. Rabbis and scholars held lectures in hidden basements. Children traced letters in dust on the floor. Education became resistance. Knowledge became an act of rebellion against the attempt to erase identity. Music survived. Someone had a violin. Someone else remembered songs. People gathered in rooms where candles flickered and played melodies that reminded them of nights before the war, of gardens, of festivals, of laughter. For a few minutes, the walls disappeared, and then the song ended, and the reality returned. But the memory lingered, and sometimes the memory was enough to get through another day. However, fear was ever present. German patrols moved through the ghetto with an authority that needed no explanation. Their boots struck the pavement rhythmically, predictably, but the predictability did not make the sound less frightening. When they knocked on doors, they did not ask. They ordered. They dragged. They took. Sometimes they came for workers. Sometimes for punishment. Sometimes simply to show that they could. The Judenrat, the Jewish councils, struggled to maintain some structure of society. They organized sanitation, distributed food, arranged labor assignments. But their authority existed only because the Germans allowed it, and the burden placed upon them was cruel. They had to decide who received work permits that meant survival, and who did not. The weight of those decisions broke many of them long before the Germans replaced them. Leadership in the ghetto was not power. It was torment. The longer the walls stood, the more the world inside felt separate from time itself. Days blended together. Seasons changed, but life did not. Newspapers circulated secretly, though their pages contained little more than rumors, scraps of outside news, a poem, a prayer. People needed to believe something. Anything. Even a rumor of resistance could give strength. Even a whisper of the war turning could restore breath to lungs that had forgotten hope. But whispers were not enough to feed a starving body. The death rate rose. People collapsed in the street. A man walking to fetch bread would fall, quietly, and not rise again. Sometimes someone covered the body with a sheet. Sometimes there was no sheet to spare. Burial societies worked endlessly, but there were too many dead. In winter, when the ground froze, bodies were left in courtyards until thaw. Children grew accustomed to stepping carefully around them. The extraordinary became ordinary. And that was perhaps the greatest horror of all, that suffering had become the fabric of daily life. But even as the population weakened, the German authorities made one thing clear. Work could postpone death. Factories inside or near the ghetto produced clothing, boots, military supplies. Work cards became worth more than food. A person with a job was useful. A person without a job was expendable. That knowledge shaped every conversation, every relationship, every fear. Yet usefulness was temporary. Everyone sensed it, because rumors had begun to spread. Rumors of camps in the east, rumors of transports that were not resettlement but disappearance. Rumors of people who boarded trains and were never seen again. People did not want to believe them. But hunger and disease and the slow tightening of every system made the rumors feel true. And then, one morning, the sound of a whistle split the air. Soldiers gathered at the gates. The patrols moved deeper into the ghetto. The raids began. The roundups were no longer sudden or random. They were organized, systematic. Names were called. Families were torn apart. People were dragged toward the trains. The walls had done their work. The population was weakened. The spirit was strained. The bodies could be moved. The ghettos had served their purpose. But the next stage would be something far worse. Because now, the trains had arrived, and their destination was death. Chapter 6. The Jewish Councils, Judenrat. When the ghettos were sealed and life inside became a struggle measured in hunger, sickness, and time, a new layer of control emerged. One that did not come from German soldiers, or Nazi officers, or the boots that patrolled the perimeter. This authority came from within. It had Jewish faces, Jewish voices, Jewish signatures. It came from men who had once been respected leaders, rabbis, businessmen, community elders, now transformed into intermediaries between the imprisoned population and those who held the power to decide whether they lived or died. These were the Judenrat, the Jewish councils. The idea did not originate in the ghettos. It was conceived in Berlin, discussed in offices where maps spread across desks and populations were turned into numbers on paper. The Nazis understood something profoundly cruel. To control a population completely, it was not enough to confine them. They needed to be governed by people they trusted, at least at first. People who spoke their language. People who knew their customs and their needs. People whose authority once meant protection, guidance, stability. By placing them in charge, the Nazis ensured that every command appeared to come from within the community, even if the command had been issued at gunpoint. The councils were formed under order, not choice. When German authorities arrived with their lists of suitable men, there was no room for negotiation. Refusal meant imprisonment, or execution, or deportation. And so the councils formed, even as their members understood the power they were being forced to hold was poisoned. These were not councils of leadership. They were councils of survival. Though survival for whom was the question that would haunt every decision they made. Their duties, at least on paper, were administrative. Census taking, food distribution, work assignments, housing arrangements, record keeping. They were told it was necessary to maintain order in the ghettos. They were told that cooperation would protect lives. They were told that obedience was the only path to stability. But the truth revealed itself slowly. Every task was designed to manage decline, to manage suffering, to manage death. Because the councils were ordered to distribute starvation rations they knew were insufficient. They were ordered to assign living spaces when they knew there was no space left to assign. They were ordered to choose which people were given work permits, work that, for a time, meant a delay from deportation. They were ordered to assemble labor battalions when the Germans demanded bodies for factories, road building, or railroad construction. And later, when the trains began rolling east, they were ordered to provide lists. Lists of names, lists of families, lists of those to be taken away. In that moment, leadership became torment. Every decision carried a life, and every life sacrificed weighed on the hands of men who had once stood at wedding ceremonies, at holidays, at celebrations, offering blessings for long life, prosperity, peace. Now their signatures could mean death. Some council members believed cooperation would save the community. They believed that showing efficiency, compliance, order would demonstrate value. They believed that survival depended on demonstrating usefulness. They believed that if they could keep the ghetto stable long enough, the war would turn, the armies would retreat, the nightmare would end. Others believed cooperation was betrayal. They believed resistance was the only moral path, even if it meant accelerating death. They believed that life under total control was no life at all. These opposing beliefs lived in the same rooms. They argued in whispers. They avoided each other's eyes in meetings. They carried weight that words cannot measure. One of the most controversial figures among the councils was Chaim Rumkowski, the head of the Lodz Ghetto. Rumkowski believed the only way to save the Jews of Lodz was to turn the ghetto into a factory so indispensable to the German war machine that it could not be liquidated. He drove production harder than any factory overseer. He ordered children as young as 10 to work. He argued, pleaded, demanded that his people become essential. But his beliefs led him to a moment that still echoes through history. In September 1942, the Germans ordered the deportation of children under 10 and the elderly. Rumkowski gathered the ghetto and spoke words that shattered whatever remained of his community's faith in him. "Give me your children." His voice was shaking, but the words were his. He believed, because he had convinced himself to believe, that sacrificing the young would save the rest. Nothing could save the rest. The Lodz Ghetto was liquidated 2 years later. The councils were not created to protect Jews. They were created to break them. Yet, to judge them only by outcomes is to ignore the impossible position they were placed in. Some council members used their authority to smuggle food, to hide vulnerable families, to create secret schools, to forge war papers that could delay deportation. Some bribed guards, negotiated small mercies, arranged escapes, shared intelligence. Some were quiet heroes whose names history never recorded. Others were corrupted by power. They lived more comfortably than the rest of the ghetto. They ate better. Their families were protected, at least temporarily. They believed their status made them untouchable. They were wrong. When the ghettos were eventually liquidated, council members were nearly always among the first to be transported. The Nazis had no intention of leaving behind evidence of their own manipulation. In Warsaw, the largest ghetto, the Judenrat under Adam Cherniakow attempted to maintain order without surrendering moral responsibility. He wrote in his diary nearly every day, documenting the slow destruction of hope. When the Germans ordered him to sign the deportation list that included children from orphanages, Cherniakow walked back to his office, sat at his desk, wrote a final note asking that his people not be blamed, and swallowed poison. Leadership had become an unbearable equation. Live at the cost of others, or refuse and die yourself. The Nazis forced this burden on the Jewish councils with full intention. It fractured communities. It redirected anger inward. It created divisions that would last even after the war was over. Survivors would debate for decades whether the councils had been victims or collaborators, protectors or executors, heroes or traitors. There is no answer that fits all, because there was no choice that was not shaped by fear. Inside the ghettos, the councils faced not only the impossible moral questions of life and death, but the daily danger of riots, protests, despair, and disorder. When food failed to arrive, when disease overwhelmed hospitals, when work assignments disappeared, they became the face of suffering. People yelled at them, begged them, cursed them, wept at their feet. And every time they promised things would improve, they were lying, and they knew it. Children watched council members walk through the streets with documents under their arms and soldiers behind them. Some saw these men as leaders. Some saw them as enemies. Some saw them as broken. All saw them as trapped. There were days when the council building was stormed by desperate citizens demanding answers, demanding hope, demanding life. And there were days when German officers entered the same building with whips and pistols, demanding quotas, demanding names, demanding lives. The council sat between a population drowning and an authority tightening its grip. To be in the council was to live in constant fear. Fear of the Germans. Fear of one's own people. Fear of being the one who signed the paper that led to death. Fear of being remembered. And yet, in the midst of this torment, some council members did something remarkable. They documented everything. Lists, letters, maps, diaries. They wrote because they understood something vital. That memory is a form of resistance. That if they could not save lives, they could save truth. They wrote so that one day, someone else would know what had happened. That the world would not be able to pretend it didn't. One of the greatest acts of preservation occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto. A historian named Emanuel Ringelblum gathered teachers, writers, and community members to document daily life under oppression. They wrote about hunger, about fear, about courage, about music, about despair. They collected ration cards, drawings, poems, school assignments. They buried everything in milk cans and metal boxes under floors and beneath rubble, trusting that someday someone would dig them up. Most of them did not survive, but their words did. The councils stand in history not as symbols of cowardice or cruelty, though some among them may have been both. They stand as proof of what oppression does to the human spirit, how it reshapes morality, how it forces impossible choices, how it makes victims wear the masks of authority. The ghettos were designed to destroy not only the body but the soul, enforcing Jews to govern themselves under the command of those who sought their annihilation was one of the most calculated cruelties the Nazis engineered. But the story of the councils does not end here, because even as leadership fractured, anger churned, and hope withered, something else was forming in the shadows of the ghettos. A whisper, a rumor, a plan. Resistance was coming, small at first, scattered, but growing. Because there comes a point when survival is no longer enough. There comes a point when people must decide not how to live, but how to fight. Chapter 7. Children in the Ghettos. There is a particular cruelty in placing a child inside a world designed to erase hope. Adults in the ghetto remembered what life was like before, what it felt like to wake up without hunger, to walk freely, to speak loudly, to believe in tomorrow without hesitation. But children, especially the youngest ones, were shaped entirely by the walls around them. Their earliest memories were not of playgrounds or open streets, not of fields or schools or sunlit mornings. Their lives began with hunger. Their worlds began with confinement. Their childhoods were spent learning how to survive. The most innocent among them had to grow older than their years or disappear before ever reaching them. The first thing to vanish from childhood in the ghettos was laughter, not because laughter was impossible, but because it cost energy. Hunger drained the body. Children who once ran freely now moved slowly, carefully, conserving strength. Their cheeks hollowed, their legs thinned, their eyes grew darker and more watchful. They looked not like children, but like small adults carrying the weight of a world they never chose. And yet, despite the heaviness, they tried to reclaim moments of joy. They drew chalk lines on sidewalks. They chased each other in slow circles. They told jokes when they could remember them. And sometimes, laughter broke free for a second before being swallowed again by the world closing in. Schooling had once been a central part of Jewish community life. Lessons did not just teach reading and arithmetic. They taught identity, memory, tradition. To remove school was to remove the future. The Nazis knew this. So formal education was banned. Desks, textbooks, open classrooms, all were forbidden. But teachers did not stop teaching. They gathered children in basements, behind curtains, in hallways lit by a single candle, whispering lessons so softly that only those closest could hear. A chalkboard could be a piece of slate. Paper scraps could hold the greatest ideas of all. Every lesson was an act of resistance. To teach a child to read was to insist that there would be a world for that child beyond the wall. But hunger interrupted even education. Children could not concentrate on arithmetic when their stomachs twisted in pain. They could not recite stories when their lips were too dry to speak. They tried. They tried because the adults needed to believe something could be preserved. But hunger was relentless. The ration lines were long. The bread was small. And children always needed more than what was available. This is where the story takes a turn, one that reveals the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the cruelty of the system that forced it. Children became smugglers, not because they were brave, not at first, but because they were small. They could fit through cracks in walls, slip beneath fences, crawl through drainage pipes. Their bodies, thinned by starvation, could squeeze through gaps that adults could not. And outside the walls, food existed. Flour, potatoes, beets, bread. Not abundance, but enough to save lives. The children became the lifeline of the ghettos. A child would wait for the guard to turn, then slide belly first under a gap in the bricks, scraping skin, tearing clothes, heart pounding so loudly they feared it would give them away. Outside, they moved fast, darting between buildings, hiding if they saw a patrolling soldier. They learned to read the street with the instincts of a fox, where shadows were safe, where footsteps came from, where sympathetic faces lived. Because not everyone outside the ghetto was cruel. Some people risked their own lives to pass food to the children. Others looked away. Others called the police. The child never knew which one they would meet. When they returned, they came back with pockets filled with potatoes or hands clutching a piece of dry bread, so tightly it crumbled. Mothers wept when they saw them return alive. Fathers held them too tightly. Siblings watched with a mixture of relief and fear, because every return meant the next journey was closer. Sometimes children were caught. German guards showed no mercy. A child caught smuggling could be beaten, shot, hanged as a warning. The ghetto would go silent as the execution was carried out. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Some children watched anyway, because they had already seen too much to pretend the world was anything other than what it had become. And yet, after every execution, someone smuggled again. Hunger made courage necessary. Survival made courage mandatory. The youngest children, the infants and toddlers, faced a different horror. Milk was scarce. Medicine was nearly non-existent. Mothers watched their babies lose weight quickly, their limbs becoming thin, their cries growing weaker. A baby's cry could alert guards or attract unwanted attention. Silence, once a choice, now became a necessity. Some mothers held their hands over their child's mouth, not to suffocate, but to save them. The most excruciating decisions in the ghetto were made not between good and bad, but between suffering and survival. Orphans became a painful symbol of this harsh reality. Many parents died from starvation or disease, leaving children alone. Jewish councils and teachers tried to establish orphanages to protect them, to create spaces where at least some warmth, food, and affection could still exist. But the orphanages were filled beyond capacity. Beds held 2 or 3 children. There were not enough blankets, not enough medicine, not enough anything. Yet they sang lullabies. They told stories. They rocked children to sleep, even when they knew that sleep might be the last peace the child would ever feel. Some of the most haunting memories from the ghettos come from these orphanages. Children lined up, small hands holding tin bowls, waiting for soup that sometimes didn't arrive. Children asking where their parents were. Children too young to understand that they were living in a place the world had abandoned. The walls held them physically, but it was the silence of outside world that imprisoned them truly. And then, as the ghettos endured, another transformation occurred. Children began to understand the system around them. They learned which guards were cruel and which might look away. They learned when the patrols changed shifts. They learned that the sound of distant train whistles meant danger. Children developed instincts that adults could not. They knew which courtyards were safe to hide in during roundups. They memorized escape paths through ruined buildings. They developed networks, whispered alliances built in alleys, stairwells, and doorways. This was not childhood. This was survival training in a prison without mercy. But with knowledge came resistance. Children carried messages for underground groups. They passed notes written on scraps of paper into hidden hands. They watched for German patrols and signaled when danger approached. They hid weapons, small ones, crude ones, but weapons nonetheless. They learned to speak quietly and act quickly. They were not soldiers in uniform. They were soldiers in silence. Some of the most powerful acts of cultural resistance were also carried out by children. They drew, they wrote, they sketched what they saw, and what they dreamed, and what they feared. Their drawings showed walls. They showed hunger. They showed sadness. But they also showed sunsets, flowers, houses without fences, a world imagined beyond the ghetto. These drawings, preserved secretly and buried in milk cans or hidden beneath floors, would later be found after the war. The world would learn from the hands of children what statistics could not say. Yet, even resistance could not stop hunger. Hunger was the constant drumbeat, the force that shaped every day. When winter came, hunger sharpened. When summer came, disease returned. Children fell sick often and recovered rarely. The cemetery grew. Small graves lined the earth, marked with stones, marked with names when families could still remember the strength to carve them. But as time passed, even grief wore thin. There were days when a burial felt like another part of the routine, and that was a loss greater than death itself. Then came the roundups. German authorities, now preparing for the next stage of the final solution, issued orders for deportations. They claimed it was relocation to labor camps. They claimed families would be kept together. They claimed it would be temporary. The lies were not believed, but there was no power to resist them at first. Children were targeted. The logic was brutal. Children could not work. Children could not serve the German war effort. Children were seen as a burden. And so children became the first to be selected for transport. This was when the ghettos screamed. Mothers clung to their children so tightly that soldiers had to break fingers to separate them. Fathers tried to stand between their children and rifles, only to be struck down. Children hid under beds, in closets, inside walls, beneath floorboards. Some were smuggled into attics or cellars, wrapped in blankets, told not to make sound. But the Germans were patient. They searched. They dragged children out by their arms, their legs, their hair. The roundups were not only acts of murder. They were acts of psychological warfare. To take a child is to break a family, to break a community, to break a people. And yet, in the midst of this agony, some children were saved. Through tunnels, through forged papers, through strangers who took them into their homes knowing they risked execution, through nurses who hid them in hospital laundry carts, through teachers who led them out one by one under cover of night. Some of these children survived. They grew up. They told their stories. Those stories echo across decades with a weight of memory that refuses to fade. But many did not survive. The ghettos reduced childhood to a fraction of what it should have been, a small flame burning against the storm. And yet, even as the storm grew, that flame refused to go out entirely. Because children carried something into the ghetto that even starvation could not erase. They carried imagination. And imagination is a form of resistance. The ghettos try to shrink the world, but in the minds of children, the world could still be larger than the walls that contain them. The world could still be free. And that belief, fragile, flickering, desperate, would soon become the spark of something the Nazis never expected. Uprising. Chapter 8. The Ghetto Economy. Work or starve. The ghettos were not only prisons. They were economic machines, carefully engineered to extract the last remaining strength from those trapped inside. Work became not only a means of survival, it became the thin line separating existence from disappearance. In a place where food was scarce, medicine absent, and time unpredictable, labor was turned into a currency, a weapon, and a form of control. Those who worked had a chance to live a little longer. Those who did not were marked, quietly, inevitably, for the transports. At first, the work was chaotic and improvised. People tried to continue the trades they had known before. Shoemakers mended old boots. Tailors repaired worn coats. Carpenters fixed broken doors. But the ghetto was not an open economy. It was sealed, cut off from resources, markets, buyers, and materials. Tools dulled. Supplies ran out. Businesses that had once thrived now struggled to survive in rooms lit by a single candle or by daylight leaking through cracks in boarded windows. Someone might stitch clothes all day for a neighbor and receive in return a potato, a crust of bread, a handful of scraps that could stretch a family's life just one more evening. Work became barter. Barter became a lifeline. But barter was never enough. The German administration controlled the borders of the ghetto, meaning they controlled who could bring in goods, who could take them out, and what prices were allowed. Every exchange, every transaction, every trade could be regulated. And so the authorities began introducing factories inside the ghettos, places where Jews were forced to produce goods directly for the German war effort. They sewed uniforms. They made boots. They assembled brushes, gloves, belts, coats. The irony was suffocating. Families who could not afford shoes for their children made thousands of pairs for German soldiers. The sound of sewing needles striking fabric was constant, rhythmic, exhausting. Women and men hunched over sewing tables for hours on end, their fingers bleeding, their backs curved, their vision blurring. They did not sew for wages. They sewed for calories. They sewed to prove usefulness. They sewed to stay on the lists. Because lists were life. Lists of workers. Lists of those deemed valuable. The German officials calculated value with numbers. Output per hour, productivity, stamina. A person was no longer a person. They were labor potential measured against starvation. A strong worker with calloused hands had a chance. A teacher, a musician, a scholar, a child, these were burdens in the eyes of the Germans. Burdens were removed. Work permits became the most sought-after papers in the ghetto. They were stamped sheets that stated, in cold, bureaucratic language, that the person named was essential. Essential, however, did not mean safe. It meant delayed. A work permit was a temporary stay of execution, always at risk of being revoked without warning. People carried them tucked into their clothes, hidden in their shoes, folded and unfolded until the creases deepened like scars. A missing document during a roundup could mean being pushed toward the trains. A forged document could mean salvation. But forging documents was a dangerous art, one requiring precision, secrecy, courage. Those who forged did so at the risk of immediate execution. Within the factories, the conditions were inhuman. Ventilation was poor. Lighting was minimal. Tools were broken. Chairs were makeshift. Supervisors, often German or Polish overseers, shouted orders with impatience and contempt. Tobacco smoke filled rooms. The air was heavy with lint and dust. Workers coughed constantly, and many contracted lung infections. But illness was a liability. A worker who coughed too much or fainted at their station could be replaced. Replacement meant transport. Transport meant disappearance. The rhythm of work became the rhythm of survival. People woke before dawn. They stood in lines to receive ration bread. They walked through narrow streets under the eyes of guards. They worked until late evening. They returned home exhausted, carrying just enough energy to eat whatever meal could be assembled. They slept in crowded rooms where the air never quite cooled. They woke again, muscles aching, stomachs empty, and repeated the cycle. It was not a life. It was a mechanical endurance. Children worked too. Those old enough to hold tools or thread needles joined their parents in the factories. Those who were not old enough to work official jobs were given tasks such as sorting scraps, patching fabric, or collecting waste. Even the smallest hands had purpose. And if a child could not work, the fear was constant. They were at risk of being selected. Over time, the ghettos developed an internal, economic hierarchy. Black markets formed quickly, often run by smugglers, opportunists, or those who had connections outside the walls. A loaf of bread could cost the equivalent of months of wages. A small piece of meat could cost everything. The value of money dissolved. Gold and jewelry, once symbols of security and heritage, became trade items for food. A wedding ring could become half a loaf. A silver spoon could become 3 potatoes. A family heirloom that had survived generations could disappear in exchange for a handful of stale bread. This was not greed. This was survival pricing. But survival pricing came with consequences. Those who had something to trade survived longer. Those who had nothing starved more quickly. It was not fairness. It was not justice. It was not choice. It was the system the Germans had engineered. Suffering distributed unevenly. Hope rationed selectively. Desperation turned into a quiet competition for life. There were those who profited, both inside and outside the walls. Some local police officers, guards, or outsiders charged high prices to bring food into the ghetto. Some were motivated by greed. Some were motivated by sympathy, though sympathy did not change the price. And some are motivated by the desire to stay alive themselves. Everyone was caught in the same machine of survival. But the Jews in the ghetto bore its weight most heavily. The work was physically exhausting, but its emotional toll was even greater. Labor no longer carried pride, purpose, or achievement. There was no joy in completing a task. There was no celebration in efficiency or craftsmanship. Work was not a part of life. Work was the cost of life. People looked at their own hands and no longer saw skill. They saw necessity. They saw the thin thread holding them to existence. Yet, even under such conditions, there were moments of dignity. A seamstress took pride in a perfect stitch, even if no one would ever see it. A father taught his child how to polish leather, even though the boots were for soldiers who guarded them. A violinist, forced to work in a brush factory, hummed melodies to keep rhythm. These acts were not resistance in the usual sense. They were resistance in the quietest, most human sense. They were declarations of identity. However, dignity could not shield the people from what was coming. Because the German administration was not building an economy inside the ghettos to sustain life. They were building an economy to extract maximum labor before death. Every job was temporary. Every worker was replaceable. The ghettos were warehouses of human exhaustion. Warehouses stocked not with goods, but with lives waiting to be depleted. And once depleted, they would be removed. As the war continued, the German demand for labor increased. The Nazis began transporting Jews from the ghettos to labor camps, where conditions were even worse. They were told they would work for better rations, better shelter, better chances. But the labor camps were factories of death, places where bodies were worn down through endless toil, cold, starvation, and violence. Those who survived the transport often died in the work. The ghettos began to empty not only because of hunger and disease, but because of deportations. And as families were torn apart, the work inside the ghettos shifted again. Factories ran with fewer workers. Output dropped. Productivity declined. The German authorities saw this not as a tragedy, but as evidence that the ghettos were no longer economically useful. And when a ghetto was no longer useful, it was liquidated. Work, which had once been a lifeline, became a trap. People worked harder to prove their value, not knowing that the evaluation had already been made. Value had never mattered. Economic purpose had never been the true goal. The ghettos were part of a process whose end had been determined long before the walls were built. This realization dawned slowly, painfully, like a whisper spreading through crowded rooms. Work would not save them. No labor could earn them the right to live. No productivity could outweigh ideology. The ghettos were not places of survival. They were places of preparation, and the trains were waiting. But before the trains came, before the ghettos were emptied, before the streets fell silent, resistance was beginning to take shape, quietly, fiercely, inevitably. Because when a system is designed to kill you slowly, the only remaining choice is to decide when and how to stop just surviving and start fighting. Chapter 9. Religious and Cultural Life in the Shadows. Life in the ghettos was structured to break the body first, but it was meant to break the spirit even more. Starvation, disease, fear, labor, these crushed strength. But identity, memory, meaning, these were deeper things, not so easily erased. The Germans understood that physical survival was only one part of existence. A person with something to believe in could endure hunger longer. A person with a story could endure sorrow. A person with community could resist despair. And so the ghettos became not only prisons of stone and wire, but battlegrounds for the soul. If the Nazis wanted to destroy a people, they needed to destroy what bound them together. Their songs, their traditions, their prayers, their sense of being alive, even in suffering. And yet, even within walls built to suffocate hope, the human spirit reached for light. Religious life did not stop when the synagogues were closed. It went underground, behind boarded windows, in attics, in kitchens, in basements where candlelight flickered faintly against cracked walls. A prayer whispered softly, so as not to draw attention, still carried the force of ancient memory. The sound was quieter now, not the loud communal chanting of open sanctuaries, but the soft murmur of voices reciting prayers for memory, lips trembling, hands clutching scraps of paper where sacred words have been hurriedly copied before books were confiscated or burned. Torah scrolls were hidden, sometimes buried, sometimes smuggled beneath coats or bread sacks. They were passed from hand to hand like precious contraband, wrapped in blankets and guarded more fiercely than food. In some ghettos, a single scroll served thousands. People gathered secretly to touch it, kiss it, weep beside it, not because they believed it would save their bodies, but because it reminded them of who they were. Shabbat was observed in whispers. No feasts, no wine, no great preparation. A crust of bread became the challah. A piece of string dipped in oil became the candle. A prayer spoken quietly among family became a rebellion. Children watched their parents close their eyes and speak to God. And even if they did not fully understand faith, they understood defiance. Passover was celebrated not with a full Seder, but sometimes with only water and a memory. A father would sit with his children and tell the story of liberation from Egypt. They would speak of deliverance, of crossing seas, of a God who does not abandon the oppressed. But sometimes the father's voice would break, because the story that once promised liberation now felt like a question hanging unanswered in the air. Still, the story was told. To stop telling, it would mean acknowledging that the oppressor had already won. But not all resistance was religious. Culture persisted too, quietly, fiercely, urgently, because even hunger could not erase the need to create. Yiddish theaters, once vibrant in cities like Warsaw and Vilna, turned into secret gatherings where plays were performed in whispers or pantomime. Actors who had once stood in bright lights now performed for audiences of 20 people packed into a dark room, sitting shoulder to shoulder on crates or the floor. The plays were no longer romantic comedies or musical reviews. They were stories about memory, about loss, about the dignity of humanity. They were tragedies that felt too close to the present to be fiction. And yet, the audience listened, not for escapism, but for recognition. They needed to hear that their suffering was seen. Music survived as well. A violin became an entire world in a place where the sky was shrinking. A clarinet could make people remember weddings. A voice humming a lullaby could make a child stop crying. Songs passed quietly down hallways, not sung loudly, but breathed carefully like something sacred. People sang to remember who they had been. They sang to remember joy. They sang to remember being free. Writers wrote. They wrote in notebooks, on scraps of newspaper, on the backs of ration cards. They kept diaries knowing they might never live to finish them. They recorded everything, what they saw, what they feared, what they prayed would someday be understood. They wrote about starvation, yes, but also about kindness, about the woman who shared her bread, about the child who returned from a smuggling run smiling, about the prayer whispered over the dead, about resilience. The most remarkable cultural effort of all took place in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Ringelblum Archive. Led by historian Emanuel Ringelblum, a group of writers, teachers, social workers, and community members came together to document everything that happened. They gathered letters, drawings, essays, theater tickets, poems, recipes, school assignments, and testimonies. They buried these documents in milk cans and metal boxes beneath buildings. They knew they would probably never see them unearthed. They knew they might die. They did it anyway. Because leaving behind a record was itself resistance. Because memory, preserved, could outlive death. Children drew pictures, and the images they created were often more truthful than any adult's words. A sun drawn above a wall, a stick figure standing behind a window, a loaf of bread larger than a house, a train with black smoke swirling behind it. These drawings were not just art. They were testimony. A child who cannot explain fear can draw it. A child who cannot describe hunger can show it. And through these sketches, the world would one day see what starvation looked like through the eyes of those who should never have known it. But cultural life inside the ghetto did not simply persist. It became a form of rebellion. To create beauty in a place designed to extinguish life was to say, we are still here. To write a poem was to defy erasure. To tell a story was to refuse silence. To teach a child was to insist that the future still mattered, even as the present collapsed. Of course, not everyone could participate. Many were too exhausted, too sick, too hungry. Some had no strength left for memory or creation, and the weight of despair was immense. Some questioned God. Some stopped praying. Some felt abandoned by everything they had believed in. Some went quiet, not out of acceptance, but out of exhaustion. There were days when silence was the only possible response. But culture is not something that exists only when there is joy. It exists wherever there are human beings. And even despair can be expressed, remembered, shared. There were moments of incredible tenderness. A mother brushing her child's hair, even though food was running out. A grandfather telling family stories, even as his voice weakened. Friends singing to each other at night, so that sleep would not feel like surrender. These small acts held the weight of entire worlds. But the ghettos were not only places of quiet cultural preservation. They were places where new tensions formed, tensions between those who still believed in faith and those who had lost it. Some people clung more tightly to religion, believing that suffering was a test, a trial, a chapter in a story not yet finished. Some believed survival was proof that God still watched. Others believed that if God existed, God had turned away. These arguments were not abstract theology. They were spoken between beds where sick children slept, between soup lines, between graves. No one was right. No one was wrong. In the ghettos, belief and disbelief were both forms of survival. As deportations increased, cultural and religious gatherings became even more urgent. The fewer people there were, the more each gathering mattered. To say a blessing over a loaf of bread was to assert that life still had meaning. To perform a song for a friend who might not survive the night was to honor them while they lived. To write down what was happening was to refuse to allow the oppressor to own the narrative. And yet, time was running out. Every week, more people disappeared. Roundups intensified. The disease spread faster. The ration lines grew shorter. The ghettos were shrinking, not in size, but in population. But even as death encroached, something else began to grow. Cultural gatherings, once meant to comfort, now became planning spaces for resistance. A whispered poem could carry a coded message. A song could be a signal. A gathering could be a meeting. The same networks used to share stories became networks used to share weapons. Faith, culture, memory, these did not merely preserve identity. They fueled will. They sharpened resolve. They prepared the spirit to rise. Because when a people continue to pray behind walls built to erase them, when they continue to sing while starving, when they continue to tell stories even as the world tries to silence them, they do not simply survive. They endure. They resist. And that resistance was about to ignite. Chapter 10, Lodz Ghetto, a city within walls. There are places in history where suffering becomes so vast, so absolute, that it reshapes the meaning of the word city. Lodz was such a place. Before the war, Lodz had been a city of industry, its factories humming, its streets crowded with merchants, workers, and families speaking Polish, Yiddish, German, and Russian. It was a city of weaving mills and textile plants, of crowded apartment blocks and busy markets. Life there is fast, practical, full of struggle, but also full of rhythm. But when the German occupation arrived, the city was redefined, not by architecture or economy, but by confinement. The Lodz Ghetto was not just a district within the city. It was a city trapped inside another city. A world encircled by walls, ruled by hunger, fear, obligation, and the fragile hope that survival might still be possible. The Lodz Ghetto began to form in early 1940. Jewish families were forced to move into the poorest northern district, Baladi. It was an old, neglected neighborhood of cracked streets and sagging houses. Before the war, it already struggled with poverty. Now, tens of thousands of people were being pushed into it all at once. The streets filled with wagons and carts carrying furniture, bedding, dishes, portraits, Torah scrolls, pots, pans, children's toys, and whatever memories could be transported. Families walked slowly, their steps heavy not from the weight of their belongings, but from the weight of not knowing whether they would ever return to their former homes. When the walls went up around the district, Lodz became sealed, completely sealed. No slipping under or around the edges. No smugglers climbing across rooftops. No tunnels leading out to food, medicine, or secret passage. The Lodz Ghetto was designed to be airtight. Every entrance had guards. Every street entering or leaving was patrolled, and the city government cut off access to all official food supplies from the outside. Starvation was not an accident here. It was a method. Inside this sealed prison, order came in the form of one man, Chaim Rumkowski. He was appointed by the Germans to serve as the elder of the Jews in Lodz. Before the war, Rumkowski had been a community leader involved in childcare institutions. He believed fiercely in organization, discipline, and structure. He believed that if the community could be made efficient enough, indispensable enough, the Germans might spare them. His motto was simple: work will give salvation. It sounded like hope. It would become tragedy. Rumkowski centralized power quickly. He formed departments for food distribution, sanitation, education, housing, transportation, health, and labor. He built an entire bureaucracy, an internal government operating inside an open-air cage. On paper, it looked like order. In reality, it was survival balanced on a knife's edge, controlled and manipulated by forces outside the ghetto and inside it both. He spoke to the ghetto as though addressing a large family he believed he could protect. His speeches were full of urgency, pleading, commanding, insisting that work was the only safeguard against destruction. He believed the ghetto needed to produce so much for the German war effort that the authorities would see value in keeping its people alive. So factories began operating day and night. Sewing workshops, metal shops, carpentry shops, leather shops. People who had never held a needle learned to sew uniforms. People who had never worked machinery learned to assemble boots. Children sorted scrap. Old women embroidered insignias. The ghetto became a factory city. But Lodz was sealed, and sealed ghettos do not receive enough food. The rations were insufficient from the start. Bread was thin, coarse, tasteless. Potatoes were precious. Soup was mostly water. People felt hunger in their teeth, in their bones, in the way their knees shook when they stood. Starvation was everywhere. Children sat on doorsteps with eyes far too old for their age. Men fainted at work tables. Women stood in ration lines before dawn, praying the bread did not run out before they reached the front. Bodies weakened, faces hollowed. The streets began to change. At first, you could tell who was hungry. Soon, hunger became universal. The difference was only in how long one could endure. Disease followed. Typhus spread quickly. Lodz had no smuggling routes to bring in medicine. Those who fell sick died slowly. Funeral carts rolled through the streets daily. The cemetery filled, then filled again, then expanded. Still, Rumkowski insisted that work was the only path to survival. He believed it with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He pushed the factories to produce more than any other ghetto in occupied Europe. He negotiated contracts with German officials. He convinced them that Lodz was essential, and for a time, this protected the ghetto. While other ghettos were liquidated, Lodz remained. Rumkowski believed this proved he was right. Many inside the ghetto believed it too. Others saw the cost. For along with work came control. Rumkowski held absolute authority. He decided who worked and who did not. And those who did not work did not eat. He issued identity cards that marked laborers as useful. A person without such a card was vulnerable to deportation. It was a system that forced impossible decisions. Who should receive a card when only one could be given? A child? A parent? A grandparent? Rumkowski believed he was saving the most lives possible. Others believed he was sacrificing some to save others. No one was wrong, because there were no right decisions in a world where death was already waiting. The ghetto adapted in strange ways. It had its own money, Rumkeys, named for Rumkowski. This currency was worthless outside the walls. The economy turned inward. A loaf of bread cost nearly everything. A coat was a fortune. A photograph of a loved one, priceless, and yet sometimes sold so the seller could eat just one more day. Children were everywhere in Lodz. And because smuggling was nearly impossible in a sealed ghetto, they had fewer ways to contribute to survival. They became thin, fragile, quiet. They learned to sit very still. They learned not to cry when hungry. They learned to watch adults closely, searching for cues of danger. The play that survived in other ghettos faded here. The streets of Lodz were too starved for laughter. And then, in September 1942, came the order that would break the heart of the ghetto. The Germans demanded the deportation of all children under 10, the elderly, and the sick. The ghetto erupted in grief. Families hid their children in attics, under beds, inside cupboards, behind walls. Nurses hid infants in laundry baskets. Teachers kept orphans in cellars. Rumors flew like dust in the air. Panic gripped every home. Rumkowski walked to the center of the ghetto. He climbed onto a platform. Thousands gathered. His voice shook, but he spoke loudly, so everyone would hear. "Give me your children." The words fell like stones. He argued that if the ghetto refused, the Germans would destroy everyone. He insisted, that sacrificing the weakest would save the rest. Mothers screamed. Fathers wept. People begged him to stop speaking. But he continued, because he believed there was no choice. Because he believed survival required this act. But no calculation, no strategy, no labor, no rationing could change the truth that had been written long before the walls were built. The children were taken. Their cries echoed through the streets of Lodz for days. It was one of the darkest moments in the history of the ghettos, and the ghetto never recovered from it. Yet production continued. Work continued. Hunger continued. Life continued. But it was not the same life. Something inside the ghetto had broken, something that even memory could not mend. Rumkowski continued to negotiate, plead, organize, work. He believed he could still save what remained. But in 1944, the German war machine began collapsing. The factories needed fewer supplies. The Lodz ghetto was no longer useful. The long postponement was over. The liquidation began. People were told they were being relocated to labor camps again. They were told to pack. They were told to trust. But they had heard such orders before. They knew what it meant. They knew where the trains led. Rumkowski himself was placed on one of the transports. He did not escape the fate of those he tried to save, or those he sacrificed. The Lodz ghetto ended not with fire or uprising, but with silence. Streets once crowded became empty. Workshops fell quiet. Windows stared blankly at a world that had watched and done nothing. The walls stood even after the people were gone, mute witnesses to a history that should never have been possible. Lodz was the longest-lasting ghetto. It endured nearly 4 years, long enough to hold generations of memory, despair, work, violence, hope, and heartbreak. It became a place where survival and suffering were bound together so tightly that separating them was impossible. But Lodz was not the only ghetto. Others were larger. Others were hungrier. Others were louder in resistance. One of them would become the center of uprising, defiance, and fire. Warsaw, and its story was waiting. Chapter 11, Warsaw Ghetto, the largest. Before the war, Warsaw was one of the most vibrant Jewish cities on earth. Over 350,000 Jews lived there, nearly 1/3 of the city's entire population. Its streets were busy from dawn until nightfall. Streetcars rattled past bakeries selling warm bread. Market vendors shouted prices in Polish and Yiddish. Children played in courtyards, weaving between adults carrying baskets filled with produce, candlesticks, books, and fabric. The synagogues were full, not just on holy days but every day, their halls echoing with prayer and study. It was a city of words, of music, of argument, of laughter. A city alive. And then, suddenly, it was a city trapped. When the Nazis invaded Poland and took Warsaw, everything changed fast. At first, there were laws, curfews, restrictions, orders to where the Star of David, forced relocation from one side of the city to another. Then, In November of 1940, the walls began to rise. They were not built quickly. They grew block by block, like a slow tightening of a noose. People watched from balconies and windows, knowing in their bones what the wall meant even before the last gap was sealed. When the final gates closed, the city split in two, those inside and those outside, those allowed to live and those allowed to die slowly. The Warsaw Ghetto became the largest ghetto in all of German-occupied Europe. 400,000 people were crammed into an area barely 1.5 square miles. Streets that once felt ordinary now felt suffocating. Apartments designed for 4 people held 12, 15, 20. Hallways became sleeping areas. Stairwells became resting places. Courtyards became gathering points where people waited for news that never came or came too late. The ghetto breathed with hunger. Hunger was everywhere. It shaped faces, slowed movements, hollowed eyes. Bread rations were so small that even crumbs felt precious. People lined up for hours to receive slices of bread that were thin and hard, sometimes moldy, sometimes half sawdust. Soup was watery, with only the memory of vegetables. Meat was unheard of. Milk existed only for infants, and even then, rarely. Hunger was not a passing sensation. It became the bloodstream. It was the constant companion of every thought. Yet Warsaw had something other ghettos did not. It had smuggling. The ghetto walls were high, but they were permeable. Holes in brick, loose boards, gaps beneath fences, sewer tunnels, abandoned cellars that led beneath the streets. Children once again became the lifeline. Their small bodies slipped through cracks, and they returned carrying potatoes, flour, onions, bread crusts, sometimes even a few coins earned through small jobs or begging. Smuggling was dangerous. Guards shot smugglers on sight. But hunger was a far greater threat. And so children continued. Day after day. Risk after risk. Women smuggled too. Their skirts hid packages. Their coats lined with pockets carried contraband. Men carried sacks on their backs, climbing through the ruins of old buildings, ducking into alleyways the moment a guard's attention shifted. Smuggling became a profession, a science, a gamble. But without smuggling, the ghetto would have starved to death in mere weeks. Smuggling was not just survival, it was defiance. Inside the ghetto, life organized itself. Schools formed in secret rooms. Classes were taught with scraps of notebooks. Rabbis continued to teach. Doctors continued to treat the sick, though with herbs instead of medicine, cloth instead of gauze, salt water instead of antiseptic. Artists continued to paint. Musicians continued to play. Writers continued to write. And Emanuel Ringelblum continued to document. Ringelblum believed that if the world was destroying the Jews must record the world. He led the creation of the Oyneg Shabbos Archive, an underground effort to document every detail of ghetto life. Reports on hunger, essays on despair, poems, children's drawings, newspapers, ration cards, posters, diaries, testimonies of deportations, accounts of smuggling networks. The archive was not created for the present. It was created for the future, for the world that would ask, what happened here? The archive answered, we were human. We lived. We suffered. We resisted. Remember us. As time passed, the ghetto changed. Disease spread faster. Typhus killed hundreds, then thousands. The dead lay in streets because the burial staff could not keep up. Funeral carts rolled every morning, collecting bodies wrapped in blankets or sheets. Children grew used to stepping around the dead on their way to fetch water or stand in ration lines. Death became ordinary, and that ordinariness was perhaps the most nightmarish part. But beneath the surface, another transformation was taking place. Hope, once quiet and cautious, began to harden into something sharper. Rumors spread about what was happening outside the ghetto. People disappearing from towns and cities. Entire communities resettled to the east, never to be heard from again. Survivors who escaped whispered the truth. There were camps. Camps where the deported were not relocated. They were killed. At first, many refused to believe it. The human mind resists horror it cannot comprehend. How could an entire people be marked for death? How could the world allow it? How could humanity invent something as monstrous as systematic murder? And then came the summer of 1942. The deportations began. Trains waited at the Umschlagplatz, a freight station near the edge of the ghetto. People were told to assemble, to bring 20 kilograms of belongings, to pack clothing and food. They were told they were going to labor camps. They were told families would stay together. The lies were precise. The lies were rehearsed. German soldiers and Jewish police enforced the roundups. Street by street, block by block, children cried as they were pulled from their mother's arms. Elderly people leaned on canes, tired, confused, unable to walk fast enough. The sound of boots and shouts filled the air. Names were called from lists. People tried to hide. They could not. They were taken to Treblinka, and they were killed. Within 2 months, nearly 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were gone. The streets emptied. The ration lines shortened. The silence grew heavy. Those who remained were those considered useful, workers deemed still necessary. The ghetto was no longer a city. It was a waiting room. And that is when resistance began, not as a whisper, but as a flame. Young people, barely in their 20s, formed underground groups. They knew now what deportation meant. They knew no work permit would save them forever. They had seen families disappear. They had lost siblings. They had buried children. And they said, no more. They smuggled weapons into the ghetto. Pistols, knives, homemade explosives. They trained in abandoned buildings. They memorized patrol routes. They created lookout networks. They wrote manifestos. They carved courage out of despair. The leaders were young. Mordecai and Neilwicks, Yitzhak Zuckerman, Zivia Lebetkin. They were not soldiers by training. They became soldiers because there was no other choice. Their parents had been raised to believe that community, faith, tradition, and work would preserve life. Their children learned that only resistance could preserve dignity. And what dignity means changes when death is certain. It means refusing to go quietly. It means deciding the manner of one's final breath. It means choosing to fight even when victory is impossible. And so the ghetto waited, not with fear this time, but with resolve. Every day, the resistance grew stronger, more organized, more determined. Every day, the ghetto hardened itself for the inevitable. Every day, people whispered, when they come again, we will not go. The Germans believed the ghetto was broken. The Germans were wrong. In January 1943, German forces returned to seize more people for deportation. But this time they met gunfire. A small battle erupted. Jewish fighters held positions in stairwells and rooftops. They shot at soldiers from windows. They fought with weapons that should not have been enough. And the Germans withdrew, not because they could not overpower the ghetto, but because they were startled. Because the ghetto they thought was dying was awakening. The deportation stopped, temporarily. But everyone knew the Germans would return, and in greater force. And when they returned, the ghetto would not kneel. It would burn. It would resist. It would become the site of the first large-scale urban uprising against the Nazis in all of occupied Europe. The uprising that would make the world see. The uprising that would show that even in the darkest confinement, even in starvation, even in certain death, the human will to resist is stronger than the machine built to destroy it. And so the ghetto prepared. The largest ghetto in Europe was about to become the battleground where the oppressed would make their final stand, not to survive, but to die as human beings, not victims. The flames of Warsaw were coming. Chapter 12, The Turning Point. From Persecution to Extermination. There is a moment in every cruelty when intention becomes irreversibly clear. For years, the Nazis had built their system step by step. Restriction, humiliation, relocation, starvation, confinement. They had spoken of Jewish disease, of racial contamination, of removing the Jews from German life. But these words, as poisonous as they were, still allowed for ambiguity. They suggested exile, displacement, containment, a prison without an execution. Even as the ghettos grew crowded and the ration lines shrank, many inside clung to the belief that the suffering had a limit, that the brutality had a ceiling, that survival, if one worked hard enough, cooperated enough, endured enough, was still possible. But there comes a point when the mask falls away, when the design reveals itself. That moment came in the East, in fields and forests, in ravines and ditches, where the earth itself became a witness. As the German army advanced into the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they were not alone. Behind the soldiers came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units composed of SS, police, and local collaborators. Their orders were clear: to follow the army's path and murder Jews, Roma, communists, intellectuals, anyone the regime defined as a threat to its racial dream. Anti-Jewish violence was no longer something hidden behind walls. It now took place in the open. The killings began with small groups. Men separated from cities, marched to fields, shot in the back in shallow pits. Then the killings expanded. Women, children, entire families, whole communities wiped out in a single day. The sound of gunfire echoed across villages. Bodies fell upon bodies in ditches carved into the earth. The Einsatzgruppen reported their numbers in neat, typed documents, lists of deaths organized like agricultural records. This was murder turned into bureaucracy. In places like Babi Yar near Kyiv, the scale was staggering. Tens of thousands of Jews were brought to a ravine over 2 days. They were told to undress, to leave their belongings, to lie down, and then they were shot. The gunfire did not stop for hours. The ground shook as bodies fell. The ravine filled. And still, there was room for more. Survivors who crawled out later described the earth moving, as if death itself was still breathing. The killers did not hide what they were doing. They wrote reports. They took photographs. They believed the war would end in German victory, and their acts would be celebrated, not condemned. The news reached the ghettos slowly at first. Rumors, whispered testimonies, numbers that felt too large to be real. Entire towns gone, villages emptied, cities where not a single Jew remained alive. People in the ghettos listened, stunned, unable to comprehend. They had believed they were being kept alive because labor was necessary, because there was a plan for relocation, because survival, though painful, still seemed possible. The reports from the East shattered that belief. The ghettos were not waiting rooms for resettlement. They were holding pens for slaughter. But even then, the killing was not yet systematic enough for the architects of genocide. Shooting was slow. Shooting required ammunition. Shooting required time. Shooting required men to stand close to their victims, to watch their faces, to hear their last words. Some killers drank themselves numb. Others bragged. Others broke. Even in cruelty, the human hand had limits. The Nazi leadership wanted a method that did not require looking into the eyes of the condemned. A system that could kill thousands at once. Something efficient. Something quiet. Something clean. This decision was not made in a battlefield trench or a camp barracks. It was made in a room with polished floors and crystal glasses. On January 20th, 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The lake outside was frozen. The room was warm. They spoke calmly. They sat straight. They passed documents back and forth. The meeting lasted less than 2 hours. The agenda was simple: how to eliminate the Jews of Europe completely. The language was technical, sterile. They spoke of evacuation, processing, special handling. They calculated how many Jews lived in each country. They debated logistics, trains, routes, timetables. They discussed the order of deportations. They made estimates of how many would die in forced labor and how many would need to be dealt with afterward. No one at the table objected. The decision made at Wannsee did not initiate genocide. It simply organized it. It made murder official state policy. It turned mass killing from chaos into a coordinated project. The ghettos would now be emptied by design. The Jews would not starve slowly. They would be transported by train to newly developed killing centers: Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, places built for one purpose and one purpose only: extermination. The language of the Nazis changed almost overnight. Resettlement, became the official euphemism. Posters were placed in ghetto squares announcing that people were to be relocated to labor camps. Families were told to pack belongings, to bring work tools, to bring food, to bring hope. They did not know the tracks led to death. They did not know the trains were sealed from the outside. They did not know there were no return trips. They did not know that Treblinka had no barracks, only gas chambers and pits. But they suspected. They feared. And fear has a sound. The sound of a mother sewing names into a child's coat so that someone might recognize them later. The sound of a father praying for a strength he no longer possessed. The sound of silence when families looked at one another and saw their last sunrise inside the walls of the ghetto. Roundups became routine. Streets filled with German soldiers. Whistles blew. Yells echoed. Families hid behind walls, inside cupboards, under staircases. Some survived one roundup, only to be caught in the next. Some survived many roundups, only to be betrayed by a neighbor, a jealous rival, a starving man desperate for one more day of life. Courage and fear existed side by side. Some people believed that going quietly would avoid suffering. Others believed resistance was the only dignity left. Some begged the councils to intervene. Some blamed the councils for the deportations. Some prayed. Some fell silent. Some broke. Some hardened. The ghettos no longer felt like cities or prisons. They felt like corridors between life and death. The deportations did not begin with screaming. They began with lists. Lists typed in offices. Lists read aloud in courtyards. Lists that decided everything. At first, the lists targeted the unemployed, then the sick, then the children, then anyone without a labor permit. And eventually, when the ghettos had been drained of every vulnerable person, the list became everyone. The trains arrived daily. People were loaded into cattle cars, wooden stock cars with no seats, no light, no sanitation. Doors slammed shut. Locking bars clanged into place. The train lurched forward. The air grew hot. The people inside fought for space near the cracks in the wood to breathe. Babies cried. Mothers fainted. Old people died where they stood. The smell was unbearable. Some trains traveled for days. When the doors opened, those who could still stand stepped onto ramps leading not to labor, but to death. The ghettos were not collapsing by neglect. They were being emptied by design. And yet, even as extermination tightened its grip, something unexpected began to grow. Not hope, not belief, something fiercer, defiance. Because once death became certain, fear lost its power. People who had lost everything realized they still possessed one choice: how to face the end. Would they walk to the trains? Or would they fight? This question did not appear in a single moment. It rose slowly, building inside hearts that had been starved but not extinguished. In Warsaw, in Vilna, in Krakow, in Białystok, in Riga, in Bedzin, young people met in secret rooms. They whispered plans over candles. They smuggled weapons piece by piece, part by part, hidden in bread sacks, toolboxes, potato bundles. They made bombs from chemicals stolen from factories. They wrote warnings and slid them under doors. They said, if we must die, we will die as human beings, not as cattle. And the German authorities, confident that starvation had broken the ghettos, did not see what was coming. They did not see the fists clenching in back rooms. They did not hear the hammers striking metal in basements. They did not listen to the quiet vow whispered across thousands of starving mouths. No more. History was shifting again. What had begun as walls had become the beginning of war. And soon, the ghettos would not be waiting rooms. They would be battlegrounds. Chapter 13. Liquidations begin, 1942 to 1944. There comes a point in every nightmare where the horror stops unfolding slowly and begins to accelerate. The years of confinement, deprivation, hunger, and despair inside the ghettos had already destroyed bodies and fractured spirits. But what came next was different. It was not the slow violence of starvation. It was not the quiet cruelty of being forgotten. It was fast. It was deliberate. It was systematic. It was final. The ghettos, once designed as holding pens, now became collection points, sites where death was organized, scheduled, recorded, and executed. The shift began quietly. Notices appeared. Orders were posted. Loudspeakers crackled. Rumors spread like smoke. At first, the announcements seemed as familiar as all the others. Just another set of commands imposed from above. Resettlement in the east. Registration for labor. Evacuation of surplus population. The words were vague by design. They suggested movement, not erasure. They suggested labor, not annihilation. They were crafted to prevent panic, to keep the process clean, controlled, manageable. But the people inside the ghettos already knew hunger. They knew loss. They knew lies. And within days of the first deportations, they also knew terror. Trains appeared at the edges of cities, freight trains, cattle cars. The same trains that once carried livestock now carried men, women, children, infants. The same stations where people had once traveled for weddings, markets, or holidays now became gateways to disappearance. Soldiers ordered families to gather with only what they could carry. They were told to bring food for the journey. They were told they would be taken to labor camps. They were told to remain calm, to cooperate, to trust. But the trains had no windows. The trains had no water. The trains had no seats. The trains had no destination marked. And no train that left the ghetto returned. In Warsaw, the deportations began in July 1942. Every day, thousands were taken to the Umschlagplatz, a rail depot that became synonymous with final separation. Families walked there together, holding hands because the alternative was unbearable. Mothers whispered to children that they would stay together. Fathers tried to steady trembling voices. Grandparents stared forward, already sensing the truth. The Germans forced people onto the trains with rifles and dogs. When the cars were full, the doors slammed shut. Then the train moved forward with a sound like thunder rolling across steel. That sound would echo in the nightmares of those who survived. The sound of departure. The sound of ending. The trains went to Treblinka. Treblinka had no factories, no workshops, no barracks meant for survival. It was a killing site disguised as a transit station. The doors opened, and people stepped out onto a platform where they were separated instantly. Men to one side, women to another. Children stayed with their mothers. The crowd was pushed toward a long pathway lined with fences. The path led to buildings labeled as showers, but there was no water, only gas. And then silence. Inside the ghettos, the silence of absence grew heavy. Entire streets lost their noise. Entire buildings stood empty. The ration lines shortened. The schools closed for lack of children. The funerals became fewer, not because death had slowed, but because death had moved elsewhere. The deportation spread. Lodz, Krakow, Białystok, Riga, Vilna, Splitska, Slonim, Lwów, Kovna, ghetto after ghetto, city after city, emptied with precision. And still, the Germans used the language of relocation. In reality, the ghettos were being erased. Selection became a daily terror. German officers entered courtyards and pointed. You. They did not need explanations. A gesture was enough. A child too small. A man too weak. A woman who had fallen ill. A grandmother unable to stand. A list. A name. A face. A fate. People hid. They built false walls and apartments. They dug crawl spaces beneath floorboards. They created hiding places inside closets and under staircases. They concealed children in sacks of laundry and piles of firewood. They whispered instructions. Don't cough. Don't move. Don't cry. Entire families held their breath as soldiers walked inches away, their boots echoing like drums inside the skull. Sometimes the hiding saved lives. Sometimes the hiding only made the discovery more brutal. No one was ready for how quickly the ghettos emptied. One week, the streets were alive with thousands of voices. The next, they were quiet. Abandoned windows stared down at open courtyards. Doors hung open. Furniture sat untouched. The everyday objects of family life, candlesticks, drawings, toys, remained like artifacts of a vanished civilization. The Judenrat, the Jewish councils, found themselves trapped in a nightmare they could neither escape nor stop. German officials demanded names, lists of people to be transported. Council members who resisted faced execution. Council members who complied drowned under guilt. Council members who tried to negotiate discovered there was nothing left to negotiate. The choices grew smaller. The possibilities shrank. Survival became a matter of delaying the inevitable. But even in these darkest days, resistance blossomed. But resistance did not always mean guns. Sometimes it meant hiding others instead of oneself. Sometimes it meant sharing the last piece of bread. Sometimes it meant writing letters that would be buried for the world to find later. Sometimes it meant telling a child a story, so they would not fall asleep afraid. Yet there were also armed resistances forming, quietly, strategically. Underground movements were gathering weapons, planning attacks, preparing to make their final stand. They had watched the deportations. They had heard the rumors of death camps. They had seen the lists. They knew that to do nothing was to die. And if death was guaranteed, then the manner of that death could still be chosen. But before uprising came desperation. In the ghetto hospitals, patients were wheeled into hallways so soldiers would not find them. Mothers wrapped infants in blankets and hid them behind walls, whispering lullabies through cracks to keep them silent. Children old enough to understand learned to hold still in the dark for hours, learning that silence could mean life. Yet even silence could not hold out forever. The Germans adapted. They searched more thoroughly. They tore apart walls. They smashed floors. They dragged people from attics and cellars. They lit buildings on fire to force those inside to flee. The fire burned bright against the night sky, illuminating the smoke rising from a neighborhood that was being erased. In some ghettos, deportations happened so fast that the living did not have time to mourn the dead. In others, they happened so slowly, so relentlessly, that grief became constant, a companion instead of a shock. And yet the ghettos endured long enough for one terrible reality to settle in. Deportation was not temporary. Deportation was death. And once the people understood this, everything shifted. Because when you cannot survive, you resist. When you cannot live, you choose how you will face death. The young became the leaders. They had lost the most and had the least left to lose. They gathered in basements, in workshops, in burned-out apartments. They swore oaths. They drew maps. They formed militias. They learned to make bombs from fertilizer and alcohol, and whatever chemicals could be smuggled or stolen. They prepared to fight, not for victory, but for dignity, because dignity, once stolen, can be reclaimed even in final acts. And then, the ghettos were nearly gone. By the end of 1942, most ghettos in Poland and Eastern Europe had been liquidated completely. Streets that once echoed with life became silent. Buildings that once held families now held only dust and memory. Cemeteries overflowed. The ghettos had no more names. Only foundations. Only ruins. Only ghosts. But not all ghettos fell quietly. In Warsaw, resistance had been growing like a flame beneath the floorboards. In Vilna, fighters had escaped to the forests. In Białystok and Bedzin, plans for uprising were being drawn. The Germans believed they had broken the ghettos. They believed they had silenced the Jewish voice. They believed they had finished the first stage of their final solution. They were wrong. Because those who remained, those who had seen starvation, deportation, separation, despair, were no longer simply prisoners. They were fighters. And the ghettos, the walls, the hunger, the death, had forged them into something the Nazis never expected to face. A people who had nothing left to lose. And therefore, a people who could not be controlled. The uprising was coming. And it would begin not with hope, but with fire. Chapter 14. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. April, May 1943. There are moments in history when a people, stripped of everything, home, food, safety, dignity, hope, discover something deeper than survival. Something that does not live in the stomach or the bones, but in the spirit. something that emerges only after everything else has been taken. It is the moment when survival is no longer possible, but meaning is still within reach. That moment came to the Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of 1943, when a starving, exhausted, and nearly extinguished population chose to rise against the most powerful military machine in Europe. The uprising did not begin with speeches or declarations. It began with silence. The silence of deportation. The silence of buildings emptied. The silence of streets where children once played. The silence of a place that had once held nearly 500,000 people and now held only a fraction of them. The Warsaw Ghetto had been shrinking for months. The Germans had already deported the elderly, the sick, the unemployed, the children. The majority had been sent to Treblinka, where death waited behind gas chambers disguised as showers. The people who remained were those deemed useful for labor, those who worked in factories inside the ghetto. They had watched everyone else go. They had watched the trains. They had watched the silence that followed. And in that silence, something hardened. The young people who formed the resistance groups had already begun organizing before the deportations reached their height. They met in attics and basement workshops. They passed notes written in tiny script. They traveled through sewer tunnels to meet with resistance networks outside the walls. They smuggled in guns, small ones, old ones, sometimes barely functional. A single pistol was cause for celebration. A few grenades were a treasure. Every bullet was counted and recounted, held like a promise. These fighters were young. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. They were not soldiers by training. They were students, poets, children of tailors and bakers and laborers. But the world had turned them into something else. They had seen families taken, neighbors shot, children starved. They had seen the truth no one wanted to speak. The deportations were not relocation. They were death. There was no future to wait for. So the question became simple and terrible. If death is guaranteed, how will we face it? With hands tied or with fists raised? The answer came in quiet, determined words, spoken in rooms lit by candlelight. We will not go to the trains. The Germans did not expect resistance. They believed starvation had broken the ghetto. They believed despair had extinguished courage. They believed power was absolute. They were wrong. On April 19th, 1943, the eve of Passover, German forces entered the ghetto to begin final liquidation. They expected a simple operation. They expected lines of people. They expected compliance. Instead, they were met with fire. From rooftops and attics, from windows and alleyways, fighters opened fire with pistols and rifles hidden inside walls for months. Grenades exploded from behind chimney stacks. Molotov cocktails burst into flame against German tanks. The first wave of German soldiers fell back in confusion. They had come for prisoners. They found an army. Inside the ghetto, the Jewish Fighting Organization operated in small, mobile units. They did not have uniforms. They did not have ranks. They did not have supplies. They had courage sharpened into strategy. They used the city's ruins as cover, striking from hiding places the Germans did not know existed. They fired, retreated, regrouped, struck again. They used tunnels and sewers to move unseen. They did not try to win. They tried to last. For the first time in years, the ghetto did not feel like a prison. It felt like a battlefield, a place where dignity could be reclaimed with every shot fired. The sound of gunfire echoed through streets where hunger once whispered. Smoke rose not from burning bodies, but from burning resistance. The Germans were stunned. How could people on the brink of death fight like soldiers? How could those who had been reduced to ration cards and labor permits become warriors? But the answer was simple. They had nothing left to lose. The uprising lasted longer than anyone expected. 1 day, 2 days, a week, longer. The fighters held off the German army, the SS, and paramilitary forces far larger and better armed than they were. They held off tanks with homemade bombs. They stopped troops with shattered rifles. They fought in stairwells, behind overturned tables, under collapsed ceilings. And the Germans grew angrier. They did not want to fight. They wanted to destroy. So they changed tactics. They set the ghetto on fire. Buildings went up in flames one after another. The heat was unbearable. The smoke choked the air. Entire streets burned like torches. The sky glowed red at night. The fighters retreated into basements, tunnels, sewers. The Germans burned those too. They poured gasoline into cellars and dropped grenades into sewer openings. Flames and screams filled the underground tunnels. Smoke filled lungs. People crawled through darkness, blinded, gasping, trying to escape fire that moved faster than they could crawl. But still, they did not surrender. They chose how to die. Mordecai Anielewicz, the commander of the uprising, wrote his final letter from a bunker on Mila Street. What happened exceeded our wildest dreams. The Germans fled twice from the ghetto. I have been witness to the magnificent, heroic fighting of Jewish men and women. A few days later, Anielewicz and his comrades died in that bunker, choosing suicide rather than capture. The Germans continued burning the ghetto block by block. They destroyed homes, synagogues, schools, bakeries, workshops. They destroyed history. They destroyed memory. They destroyed the physical world of Jewish Warsaw. But the spirit that rose from those flames is something they could not destroy. The fighters who survived the initial siege retreated deeper underground. Some escaped through sewer tunnels and joined partisan units in the forests. Some continued fighting inside the ruins for weeks after the Germans declared victory. They emerged from rubble like ghosts, firing at patrols, then disappearing again. For them, survival was no longer simply survival. It was testimony. The uprising did not save the ghetto. It did not stop the deportations. It did not end the war. It did not bring back the dead. But it shattered one of the greatest lies ever forced upon the Jewish people. The lie that victims of genocide went willingly. They did not go willingly. Not in Warsaw. Not in Vilna. Not in Białystok. Not in Krakow. Not in Bedzin. Not in Lachwa, where the first ghetto uprising took place. Not in Treblinka, where prisoners burned the camp to the ground. Not in Sobibor, where captives organized a revolt and fled into the forest. Resistance appeared everywhere death tried to silence life. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising stands not because it was the largest or the most symbolic or the most public, though it was all of these, but because it reveals something fundamental about the human spirit. If a person has nothing left but their voice, they will speak. If a person has nothing left but their hands, they will fight. If a person has nothing left but their name, they will shout it into the fire. The ghetto burned. The fighters died. The walls fell. But the uprising did not disappear. It became memory. And memory, when carried, when spoken, when honored, becomes resistance in every generation that follows. The uprising did not save the ghetto, but it saved something else. It saved the truth of what it means to be human in the face of annihilation. It saved the story that even in extinction, dignity can rise. And now the world had seen something that could not be unseen. A people marked for death had chosen how to stand in their final hour. The ghettos had been built to break the spirit. Instead, the spirit had lit a fire. The flames in Warsaw were not only flames of destruction. They were flames of defiance. And the world would carry them forward. But the war was not over. And the extermination machine had not yet reached its final form. What came next will be the darkest chapter of all. Chapter 15, The Last Days and Liberation. In the final years of the ghettos, the world had already changed around them. The great cities of Europe were burning. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of German retreat. The factories that once powered the Reich were slowing, starved of fuel and metal. The skies over Germany filled with Allied planes. The war was turning. But inside the ghettos, those that still existed, time did not move forward. It only ran out. The ghettos were nearly gone by 1944. Most had been liquidated entirely, emptied into the trains that ran day and night toward death camps. But in the east, in places like Kovna, Riga, Vilna, Lodz, Białystok, Czestochowa, and a handful of others, pockets of life remained. They did not remain because they were safe. They remained because the Germans believed there was still something left to extract. More labor, more goods, more value before the final extermination. These final ghettos became strange paradoxes. They were places where death was inevitable, yet life continued in small and stubborn ways. People still woke in the morning. They still looked for bread. They still whispered rumors. They still hoped, though hope no longer meant survival. Hope meant simply one more day, one more sunrise, one more hour to remain human. Lodz was among the last. Rumkowski's dream of survival through labor had delayed the liquidation longer than almost any other ghetto. But by mid-1944, even that illusion shattered. German officials arrived and announced that the entire population was to be resettled. There were no lies this time. The people knew. They had seen too much. The streets filled again with carts and bundles, with crying children and silent fathers. Rumkowski himself was placed onto a train. He did not return. The train went to Auschwitz, and the last major ghetto fell. Those who survived the liquidation of the ghettos were not freed. They were transported to camps. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Stutthof, Ravensbrück, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, places where starvation became factory policy, where smoke rose day and night, where numbers replaced names, where the goal was not work, but destruction through work. The people who had survived the ghettos no longer looked like civilians. They looked like shadows. Their clothes hung loose. Their hair was cut. Their cheeks were concave. Their eyes were vast and empty and ancient. They walked because stopping meant dying. They worked because refusing meant execution. They lay down to sleep each night, unsure if they would wake again. For some, the camps were only the next stage of the same nightmare. For others, it was a new horror layered upon one they had barely survived. The memory of the ghettos, of childhoods lost, of families separated, of homes locked behind walls, now mixed with the memory of chimneys that smoked with human ash. But the ghettos left one more legacy before they disappeared entirely. They left witnesses. They left survivors. Not many, but some. And the survivors carried stories like wounds, stories they could not fully speak. Not yet. Not while the world was still burning. As the German army retreated, the ghettos, camps, and killing sites were abandoned or destroyed. The Nazis tried to erase the evidence. They burned documents. They demolished crematoria. They forced prisoners to dig up mass graves and burn the bodies. They marched tens of thousands on death marches, long forced marches across frozen landscapes where anyone who stumbled was shot. Snow on the roads was stained with blood. Villagers watched from windows, uncertain whether to help, to hide, or to turn away. But still some survived. In January 1945, the Red Army reached the ruins of Auschwitz. The soldiers who entered did not understand what they were seeing. They had seen battlefields. They had seen famine. They had seen devastation. But they had not seen this. They saw skeletal figures in striped uniforms. They saw piles of shoes, hair, glasses. They saw warehouses full of belongings from thousands of people. They saw chimneys in ash. They saw bodies stacked like lumber. One soldier wept openly. Another could not speak. The snow fell softly that day, like something trying to cover what could never be covered. The liberation of Auschwitz was not triumph. It was revelation. It was the pulling back of a curtain to reveal a world built to kill. In the months that followed, camps across Europe were liberated, sometimes by the Soviets, sometimes by the Americans, sometimes by the British. Each liberation was the same, and yet different. In one camp, survivors crawled toward the soldiers. In another, survivors were too weak to move at all. They stared blankly, unsure whether the uniforms before them represented death or rescue. The liberators offered food, but even that could kill a starved body too quickly. They offered blankets. They offered water. They offered words. Some survivors fell to their knees and kissed the earth. Some lay silently. Some could only cry. Some could not cry. But the liberation of the camps did not mean the liberation of the survivors' memories. The survivors carried the ghettos inside them. They carried the sound of closing gates. They carried the smell of burning. They carried the memory of the dead, the children, the parents, the brothers, the sisters, the friends, the neighbors. They carried guilt. Why them? Why did they live when so many did not? They carried silence because the world was not ready to hear. Some survivors returned to their hometowns. They found strangers living in their houses. They found synagogues turned into warehouses. They found graves desecrated. They found neighbors who looked surprised to see them alive, and not always pleased. Some survivors tried to rebuild. Some emigrated to new lands. Some stayed silent for decades, because speaking meant opening wounds that had never healed. But the ghettos did not vanish into silence, because the survivors did not remain silent forever. Over time, the stories emerged in diaries, in testimonies, in courtrooms, in living rooms, in classrooms. Survivors spoke, slowly at first, with shaking voices, then steadily, then with the strength of memory sharpened into purpose. They told the world what a wall can do, how a city can shrink to a prison, how a childhood can disappear in hunger, how a community can be turned into numbers on lists and bodies in trains. They told the world that the ghettos were not places of helplessness. They were places of humanity strained to its limits. Places where people taught children to read, even when they knew they might not live to see them grown. Places where strangers shared bread, because to share was to remain human. Places where prayers were whispered in basements, not because prayer would save them, but because prayer reminded them that they mattered. Places where resistance was born not from weapons, but from refusal. Refusal to surrender identity. Refusal to surrender dignity. Refusal to surrender the final truth that every human life has meaning. The ghettos were not simply prisons. They were crucibles where the human spirit was tested in ways almost unimaginable. Some did not survive that test. Their loss is immeasurable, but some survived, and their survival is a testimony written not on paper, but in the continuation of life itself. Every child born to a survivor is an answer to the ghettos. Every story told is a refusal to let the walls rise again. Every memory shared is a blow against silence. Today, the ghettos are gone. Their walls are broken. Their streets have changed. New families live where Jewish life once thrived. The world looks different. But if you walk those streets slowly, if you listen carefully, there are places where memory lingers, in the shape of a building, in the curve of a courtyard, in the silence of a corner where the past is not fully faded. And sometimes, if you stand long enough, you may feel it. A voice, a whisper, a presence, not of death, but of those who lived, those who loved, those who believed, those who resisted, those who endured, those who should never have been lost. The ghettos were built to erase a people, but the people remain, in memory, in story, in blood, in breath, in the simple act of continuing. What remains now is not mourning alone. What remains is responsibility. To remember, to speak, to teach, to refuse, to ensure that the world never again learns how to build walls around a people and call it order. The ghettos have ended, but their lesson has not, and it never will.